Section 1. Welcome to Springfield After Dark. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles in when everyone else has gone to sleep. The house goes still, the notifications stop, and somewhere in that silence, if you grew up watching The Simpsons, you find yourself thinking about Springfield, about the yellow sky over Evergreen Terrace, about the low hum of the nuclear plant somewhere in the distance, about Homer stumbling through the front door and Marge sighing in that specific way she has, and the television glowing in the living room long after everyone has gone to bed. That's what we're doing tonight. We're going back to Springfield. Not to the golden age, not to the perfect seasons that everyone agrees on. We're going to the other Springfield. The Springfield of the episodes that made fans furious, that sparked arguments that lasted for years, that got written off as proof the show had lost its mind. The controversial ones. The ones that divided audiences right down the middle and never quite healed that divide. And here's the thing about those episodes. When you slow down and actually sit with them, actually let them unspool at a quiet hour when your defenses are down, they reveal something that's hard to see when you're watching in a combative mood. They reveal a show that was always stranger and more interesting than its reputation in any given moment suggested. A show that was genuinely trying things, sometimes failing, sometimes stumbling onto something remarkable by accident, and always caring about these characters even when the execution didn't match the ambition. So tonight, we're not here to argue. We're not here to rank or defend or prosecute. We're here to watch and to tell the stories and to let the controversies breathe a little. To understand not just what happened in these episodes, but why, and what the fans were really reacting to, and what it means that a cartoon sitcom could generate this much genuine passion and grief from people who loved it. Get comfortable. Turn the lights down if you want. Let the week go. We're spending tonight in Springfield, and we've got all the time in the world. Let's start somewhere that might surprise you. Not the infamous Season 9 premiere that shook the fan base to its foundation. Not the episode that rewrote a character's entire history in 42 minutes and then legally criminalized anyone who brought it up. We'll get there. But before any of that, let's go back to a quieter controversy. One that's almost gentle by comparison, but that set the tone for everything that was about to happen to this show. Season 8, Episode 25, The Secret War of Lisa Simpson. Now, you might be wondering why this one makes the list. On the surface, it's a perfectly reasonable episode. Lisa gets into a military academy, she faces sexism, she proves herself. It sounds like exactly the kind of socially conscious storytelling that the show had always done beautifully, and in many ways it is. But there's a conversation that happens inside this episode, buried under the main storyline, that fans have been arguing about for nearly 30 years, and it centers on Bart. Here's the setup. Bart accidentally links several police megaphones together in the evidence locker at the Springfield police station and creates a sound wave so powerful it shatters every window in the town, traumatizes a flock of pigeons, and causes a kind of ambient despair among the citizenry that Chief Wiggum immediately recognizes as a catastrophic disciplinary problem. Abe Simpson's reaction is beautiful, by the way. He's sitting in his chair at the retirement home when the wave hits, and he just looks around slowly and says something to the effect of what he's experienced in his long life. And then he goes back to sleep. Homer and Marge, understandably at their wits' end with Bart's escalating behavior, decide to enroll him in a military academy called Rommelwood, and Bart, to everyone's surprise, finds that he actually thrives in the structure, the discipline, the order, the sense of belonging to something that has rules that are enforced consistently, unlike Springfield where the rules change based on who happens to be watching. The controversy here isn't really about Bart. It's about what happens when Lisa decides she wants to attend Rommelwood too. The academy is all male. Lisa insists on being admitted. She is admitted grudgingly, under pressure from Marge and Homer who invoke her legal rights, and then she is made to suffer for it by the other cadets, who give her the silent treatment and make her feel entirely invisible. There is a particular cruelty to being ignored by an entire room of people who know you're there. It's a kind of social violence that leaves no marks. What bothers fans about this episode, what generated the controversy, is not any of that. The story of Lisa's struggle is handled with genuine sensitivity. The problem for many viewers is the ending. Lisa completes the Eliminator, a brutal obstacle course, and succeeds. The cadets, who have been ignoring her for the entire episode, immediately acknowledge her. They clap, they accept her. The conflict is resolved. And the criticism goes like this. The show reduced institutional sexism to a problem that a single exceptional performance can fix. Lisa doesn't change the system. She endures the system until the system decides to acknowledge her. And because she is exceptional, because she completes the course despite exhaustion and isolation, she earns a moment of inclusion that was never structurally guaranteed. The implication, if you read the episode harshly, is that girls need to prove themselves to gain acceptance in male-dominated spaces, and once they prove themselves, the space graciously opens, which, as social commentary, is considerably less radical than The Simpsons often aspired to be. The counterargument, and it's a fair one, is that the show was depicting reality rather than endorsing it, that the ending isn't triumphant so much as it is bittersweet. Lisa wins, but the thing she wins is permission to be in a room that should never have required proof in the first place. There's a kind of hollow quality to the applause she receives. You can read it as the show acknowledging that inclusion granted by performance is not the same as inclusion granted by right. Bart's goodbye to her at the end of the episode has always made fans emotional. He's been keeping her company at night, running alongside the course she practices on, and he doesn't tell her that he's doing it until the episode is almost over. He was never there to compete with her or to help her in any obvious way. He was just there, and that small, quiet act of sibling solidarity from the show's most famous troublemaker is one of the loveliest things Season 8 ever did. But the controversy lingers, because what could have been a story about an institution being fundamentally changed became a story about an individual being individually exceptional. And for a show with Lisa's track record on these subjects, it felt to some viewers like a missed opportunity. That said, revisiting it now, at this quiet hour, there's something almost comforting about the way it plays. The Rommelwood sequences have a kind of rhythmic quality, all drills and formations and the crack of commands across an open field, and Lisa moving through them in steady, determined silence. There's a meditative quality to watching someone simply refuse to stop. Whatever you think about the episode's politics, the image of Lisa Simpson at 4 a.m, running the eliminator alone in the dark while her brother watches from the tree line, is one that stays with you. Now, Season 9. If you know anything about Simpsons fan discourse, you know what's coming. Season 9 is where the arguments get serious. It's where the tone shifts in ways that still provoke genuine debate. And it starts, almost immediately, with an episode that is either a brave creative gamble or the single biggest misstep in the show's history, depending on who you ask and how much you loved Principal Skinner. We're going to get to the principal and the pauper very soon. That one deserves its own long, careful telling. But let's ease in. Let's start with the episode that aired just before it, the one that opened Season 9 and set a tone that made fans nervous about what was coming. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson. This one is not controversial in the traditional sense. It's controversial in the sense that it's brilliant and everyone knows it, but watching it in the post-September 2001 world became something complicated. For a long time after the attacks on the World Trade Center, this episode was pulled from syndication rotation. The Twin Towers appear prominently throughout the episode. The entire second half of the episode is set in Lower Manhattan, and for a period of years the episode simply wasn't shown. When it came back into a world that had changed around it. And watching it now, there's a layered quality to it that the original broadcast couldn't have had. Springfield's relationship with New York City has always been played for comedy. The idea that Homer had such a specific traumatic relationship with the city, that he had been told at gunpoint by a Jew to leave during a bad night in the late 1970s, is exactly the kind of absurdist backstory The Simpsons did brilliantly in its peak years. The accumulation of indignities that Homer suffers in the city over the course of a day is cartoonishly escalating in the best possible way. But here's what makes the episode genuinely melancholic to watch now. The buildings. The towers. The New York of this episode is preserved in amber in a way that no other Simpsons episode quite matches. Because while Springfield is always Springfield, unchanged and floating in its eternal present, New York is a city that people know in their bones, and the New York of this episode is a New York that no longer exists in the physical world. It's fiction about a real place, and the real place has changed catastrophically since the fiction was made. There's something in that gap, that distance between the cartoon version and the real world's history, that gives the episode an emotional weight it was never designed to carry. You can laugh at Homer chained to a parking meter, serenaded by the aggressive honking of the gridlocked city around him, and underneath the laugh is something quieter and harder to name. That is the specific kind of controversy that only time can create. Not a controversy about writing choices or character decisions. A controversy created by the world changing around a piece of art until the art means something its creators never intended. Now, let's get quiet for a moment. Let's slow down. Because what I want you to understand, before we go any further into the darker waters of seasons 9 through 25, is what the Simpsons controversy actually felt like from the inside of the fan community. What it felt like to love this show and then watch episodes that seemed to break something. The Simpsons, in its prime, had a specific quality that is very hard to describe to someone who didn't experience it. It was funny, obviously. Deeply, structurally funny in a way that was doing multiple things at once. Comedy that worked on the surface for casual viewers and had an entirely different architectural layer underneath for people paying close attention. But it was also emotionally honest in a way that animated television almost never was before it. The show could make you laugh for 20 minutes and then, in the final 2 minutes, do something so quietly devastating that you sat there in your living room, not entirely sure what had just happened to you. Season 3's Radio Bart, Season 4's Last Exit to Springfield, Season 5's Cape Fear, Season 6's Homer's Triple Bypass, Season 7's Mother Simpson. These episodes were in a conversation with the audience about what television could do, what animation could do, what a comedy about a working-class family could do. They were raising the stakes of the form with every season. So, when the show began to change, when the balance started to shift, when the emotional honesty started to get crowded out by increasingly elaborate plots and guest stars and what critics called flanderization, the fan community's reaction wasn't simple disappointment. It was something more like grief. The specific grief of watching something you love make choices you can't understand, choices that seem to contradict everything that made the thing lovable in the first place. That grief is what powers every controversy we're going to discuss tonight. Not nastiness, not contrarianism, grief. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I genuinely love knowing who's on the other side of this. And if this kind of storytelling is something you want more of, subscribing means you'll be there when the next one goes up. Now back to Springfield. Number section. 2. The Principal and the Pauper. The episode that changed everything. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper, aired the 28th of September, 1997. This is the one. If you want to understand what it feels like to be a devoted Simpsons fan and watch an episode that seems to detonate everything you thought you understood about the show, this is the case study. This is the episode that fans cite more than almost any other when they're trying to explain what happened to The Simpsons, and it deserves a long, slow, careful examination. Not because it's the worst episode ever made, though it ranks near the bottom of many fan lists, but because of what it revealed about the nature of this universe, and what the fan response revealed about the nature of fan attachment. Let's go back to the beginning of Seymour Skinner, not the Armin Tamzarian version, the one we thought we knew. Principal Skinner arrived in Springfield's world as a specific and recognizable type, the officious, rule-bound school administrator who has no life outside his institution and no identity outside his title. In the earliest seasons, he was fairly one-dimensional. He was the obstacle between Bart's chaos and whatever Bart was trying to accomplish this week. He existed to be outwitted and humiliated. But then the show did something that it did brilliantly throughout its golden years. It deepened him. It found the human being inside the archetype. The Skinner that emerged over seasons 3 through 7 was a genuinely complex character, a man still psychologically defined by his service in Vietnam, where he was a prisoner of war and experienced things he would never fully articulate. A man whose relationship with his mother Agnes was an intricate dance of codependence and resentment, where he loved her deeply and was also slowly suffocated by her presence in his life. A man who harbored a secret romantic longing for Edna Krabappel, the teacher just down the hall, that was played sometimes for comedy and sometimes for something genuinely touching. The character of Seymour Skinner had accumulated, across 6.5 seasons and dozens of episodes, a specific and recognizable inner life. He was a Vietnam vet, he was a son, he was a principal who had found his calling in a difficult school, in a difficult town. He was, despite all his pomposity and rule-following and occasional cowardice, a recognizable human being. The Principal and the Pauper erased all of that. Here's what happens. Springfield Elementary is celebrating the 20th anniversary of Skinner's tenure as principal. There is a party. There is a cake. There is a sense of community gathering around a man they've known for 2 decades, and then a stranger walks in. His name is Sergeant Seymour Skinner. He is the real Seymour Skinner. He is a decorated Vietnam veteran. He was captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia, presumed dead, and he survived. He escaped, he came home, and when he arrived in Springfield to find his mother and reclaim his life, he discovered that someone else had been living it. The imposter's real name is Armin Tamzarian. He was, before Vietnam, a street punk, a kid with no family, no prospects, no future. He got drafted and served alongside the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt guilty enough to go find his mother and tell her what had happened. But when Agnes saw him, she thought he was Seymour. She needed him to be Seymour. And Tamzarian, who had never been needed by anyone in his entire life, took the identity and wore it home. This is a legitimately interesting premise. The idea of a man so hollowed out by a life of rejection that he would step into a dead man's identity just to feel wanted, just to have somewhere to belong, is actually rich dramatic territory. There's a genuine story buried in this concept. But the episode doesn't tell that story. It tells the comedy version of that story, which is something different, and it does so in a way that commits to neither the comedy nor the drama with any real conviction. The episode keeps cutting away from the emotional weight of what it's depicting to make jokes, and the jokes keep undercutting the moments that might have been genuinely moving. Skinner, or Tamzarian, or whoever he is, becomes a figure of pity in a way that's more uncomfortable than funny. The real Skinner, the decorated veteran whose identity was stolen, is played as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. And then comes the ending that fans have never forgiven. The town holds a meeting. The truth is fully exposed. Every single person in Springfield now knows that their principal is an imposter. The real Seymour Skinner is present. The choice before Springfield is clear. Acknowledge the truth or pretend it never happened. Springfield votes to pretend it never happened. Judge Snyder, in what the show presents as a joke but which lands as something much stranger, issues a legal decree that Armin Tamzarian shall be Seymour Skinner in perpetuity, that the real Seymour Skinner shall be removed from Springfield and is henceforth banned from returning, and that under penalty of torture it shall be illegal for any resident to ever mention the name Armin Tamzarian again. And the real Skinner is literally tied to a train car and shipped out of town. The episode then ends. Everything goes back to normal. The next episode, Springfield is exactly as it was. Skinner is Skinner. The whole thing never happened. There's nothing to acknowledge because the acknowledgement has been criminalized. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner and Burns and half a dozen other characters, was publicly unhappy with this episode. He said in interviews that he felt the storyline fundamentally disrespected a character that he and the writing staff had spent years developing. He wasn't wrong. The Skinner, who had emerged from 6 seasons of careful storytelling, was an invention of the writers, yes, but he was an invention the audience had developed a relationship with. And the episode essentially declared that relationship null and void. Skinner was never Skinner. Everything you thought you knew was a lie, and rather than dramatize that revelation with any real weight, the show had the town vote to go on believing the lie, made it legally binding, and moved on. The critics at the time were divided. Many found the episode boldly experimental, a meditation on the constructed nature of identity and the way communities choose their myths over their realities. Some called it the show's most philosophically interesting episode. Others called it the moment The Simpsons stopped caring about its own mythology. The fan community, then and now, skews heavily toward the latter view. On essentially every ranked list of Simpsons episodes, the principal and the pauper appears in the bottom 5, often at the very bottom. Fan polls across multiple platforms consistently vote it the worst episode of the entire series, even ahead of episodes from the much later, widely agreed-upon decline years. And yet, revisiting it now, in the small hours, with the sound turned down and a cup of tea going cold on the table, there's something in this episode that its harshest critics undervalue. The ending isn't just lazy. It's genuinely disturbing in a way that the show maybe intended, maybe stumbled into, but that is undeniably present. Because what Springfield does in that town meeting is exactly what Springfield has always done. It takes an uncomfortable truth, packages it as a problem, and votes to make it go away. The mechanism is just made explicit this time. There's a vote. There's a legal decree. There's the physical expulsion of the man whose existence constitutes an inconvenient fact. In every other episode where the town forgets something catastrophic, the forgetting happens between episodes, off-screen, unexamined. Here you watch it happen. You see the vote, you see the decree, you see the exile, and if that makes you uncomfortable, good. That's probably the point. The show was showing you something true about how communities function, how they protect themselves from truths that would require changing, how they enforce consensus through the kind of low-grade social pressure that doesn't look like violence from the outside, but feels like it from the inside. Armin Tamzarian is still principal. Springfield is still Springfield. And the man whose identity was stolen is tied to a train, moving further from his home with every mile. There is something genuinely unsettling about an episode that a town can just vote away. Something that says more about institutional memory and collective denial than a dozen more sophisticated attempts at the same subject. That doesn't make it a great episode, but it makes it a more interesting one than its reputation suggests. What's worth sitting with if you're still awake is the specific quality of the grief that fans felt about this episode, because it wasn't just disappointment in the episode itself. It was a more diffuse anxiety about what the episode signaled. If Skinner's entire backstory could be erased and replaced in 42 minutes, what else was negotiable? What else could the show just decide to overwrite? The Simpsons had always had continuity issues. Long-running animated shows necessarily do. Dates shift, timelines blur, small details contradict each other. Fans were used to this. It was part of the deal. But the principal and the pauper felt different because it wasn't an accidental continuity error. It was a deliberate act of continuity revision that the episode itself acknowledged and made into its subject. The show was explicitly saying, the story you thought you knew about this character was a story he made up, and now we're making up a new story, and you have to go along with it. For fans who had invested years in the careful accumulation of Skinner's identity, that felt like a betrayal, not a small one. And the episode aired in episode 2 of season 9, which meant it landed before the season had even had a chance to establish what kind of season it was going to be. It landed like a statement, an opening argument about what the show was now willing to do. And the fans who didn't like what they heard spent the rest of season 9 waiting to be proven wrong, hoping the next episode would course correct, watching the show with a wariness that hadn't been there before. That wariness, once established, is very hard to shake. It colors everything that comes after it. Episodes that might have landed differently in season 6 or 7 arrived in season 9, carrying the weight of what had already happened, already been broken, already been proved negotiable. That's the real legacy of the principal and the pauper. Not the bad episode, the changed relationship between the show and its audience. The moment the audience stopped trusting the show with the things they loved. Number, Section 3, Homer's Enemy, The Uncomfortable Mirror. Season 8, Episode 23. Homer's Enemy. This one is different from everything else we're discussing tonight, because its controversy doesn't come from bad writing or reckless storytelling decisions. It comes from something that makes the show's audience genuinely uncomfortable, and the discomfort is the point. Frank Grimes is one of the most memorable characters ever to appear in a single episode of The Simpsons. He enters Springfield as a man who has done everything right. He was raised in poverty, in an orphanage. He worked from an early age, put himself through school through sheer force of will, earned a degree in nuclear physics through a correspondence course, earned a degree in nuclear physics through an actual night school, and arrived at the Springfield nuclear power plant as a model employee, competent, diligent, earnest, and determined to do his job well. And he is immediately, deeply, personally offended by Homer Simpson. The episode is essentially a thought experiment. What would happen if a genuinely capable, genuinely hardworking person were placed next to Homer and forced to understand that Homer's life works out just fine, better than fine, while their own life, built on actual effort and actual merit, is a grind without end? What would it do to a person to stand next to Homer and watch the world reward his incompetence while ignoring their competence? The answer the episode gives is, it would drive them completely to pieces. Grimes becomes increasingly unhinged as the episode progresses. He watches Homer eat his lunch. He watches Homer win a children's drawing contest at work. He watches Homer be photographed with President Gerald Ford. He watches Homer survive catastrophe after catastrophe through pure dumb luck while he, Grimy, lives in a single room above a bowling alley and cannot catch a break. His breakdown is both comic and horrifying, accelerating from mild irritation through genuine anguish to screaming madness in the span of 20 minutes. His final act is to grab live electrical wires in the plant, mocking Homer for the kind of reckless behavior that Homer exhibits constantly without consequence. But Frank Grimes is not Homer. He is not immune to consequences. He is not protected by cartoon logic. He is, within this episode, the representative of the real world inside Springfield's unreality. And the real world doesn't survive contact with Springfield. He dies, electrocuted by the wires he grabbed. And at his funeral, Homer falls asleep and mumbles something funny, and the whole congregation laughs, including Bart, including Lenny and Carl. The funeral ends in laughter while the only genuinely competent employee at the nuclear power plant is laid in the ground. The controversy this episode generates is entirely different from the controversy around the principal and the pauper. Nobody argues that Homer's enemy is poorly written. The writing is sharp and precise and deliberately uncomfortable. The controversy is about whether the show should have made it at all. Because Homer's enemy is essentially a savage self-criticism, the show looks directly at its own main character and says, by the logic of the real world, this man is a disaster. He is incompetent, self-absorbed, dangerously negligent, and he has never faced a consequence proportionate to his actions. If a real Frank Grimes existed, he would be correct to be outraged. Homer Simpson, when viewed from outside the protective bubble of cartoon logic and audience affection, is not lovable. He is infuriating. He is genuinely harmful to the people around him. And the world of Springfield rewards him anyway because it's a cartoon and the rules work differently. Some fans found this liberating. They loved that the show was willing to examine its own premise with this much honesty, to put a character on screen who articulated exactly the critique that a sophisticated viewer might make of the show's basic setup. Other fans found it deeply unpleasant to watch. They didn't want to spend an episode feeling guilty for loving Homer. They didn't want a critique of the show embedded in the show itself. They wanted what they always came for: Homer's bumbling affection, his genuine love for his family, the warmth underneath the chaos. And Homer's enemy stripped all of that away and showed them something rawer and harder to feel comfortable with. There's also a reading of the episode that becomes more interesting over time. Frank Grimes represents something real about the tension between merit and luck, between effort and reward, between the life the world tells you that you deserve if you work hard and the life that actually materializes. The episode aired in 1997, but its thesis, that the world doesn't actually reward competence and effort as reliably as we're taught to believe, has only become more resonant in the decades since. Grimes is genuinely correct. He has done everything right. He should have more. The fact that he doesn't, the fact that Homer has everything despite doing nothing right, isn't just a comedy premise. It's a real thing that real people experience in their working lives. The rage that Grimes feels is a recognizable rage, and the show's refusal to resolve it, to let Grimes be consoled or to let Homer learn something or to give either of them a moment of grace, is part of what makes the episode so hard to shake. There's no catharsis. Grimes dies. Homer sleeps through the funeral. The world continues as it was. Justice does not arrive. For an episode of a primetime animated comedy, that's an extraordinarily bleak thing to do, and it was brave. Whatever discomfort it caused, whatever fans wished it had done differently, the episode had the courage of its convictions in a way that most television, then and now, would not. There's a nighttime quality to this episode that I've always found oddly calming, despite its harsh content. The plant at night. The quiet of the Springfield streets outside Grimey's window, above the bowling alley, the sounds of the funeral. Something about the episode, stripped of its comedy beats and seen purely as a story of a man in an impossible situation, has the rhythm of a very specific kind of sadness. The kind you feel not for yourself but for the world's general indifference to effort. If you're still awake, hold on to that. Because what's coming next is an episode that generated a very different kind of controversy, one built not on savage self-criticism but on what felt to many fans like the show completely checking out. Number. Section 4. Saddle-Sore Galactica. The Shark and the Horse. Season 11, Episode 13. Saddle-Sore Galactica. Aired the 6th of February 2000. Here's the setup. The Simpson family attends a state fair. Homer, because Homer is Homer, makes an impulsive decision with enormous consequences. He rescues a horse who has been used as a diving act, a horse who leaps from a high platform into a tank of water for the entertainment of fair crowds. The horse, whom Bart names Duncan, is brought home, and Homer decides Duncan is going to be a racehorse. Duncan wins races. Duncan becomes successful. Homer becomes embroiled in the world of horse racing with his usual combination of enthusiasm, incompetence, and inexplicable luck. This is all broadly fine. This is the kind of episode premise that Season 11 does regularly and does with reasonable competence. Then the jockeys show up. This is where the episode leaves the realm of normal Simpsons plotting and enters a zone of pure surrealism that either reads as inspired absurdism or tone-deaf randomness, depending on your relationship with the show at that point in its history. It is revealed that the world of horse racing is secretly controlled by a society of mutant jockeys who live underground in a hidden community and who emerge at night to threaten any horse owner who challenges their carefully maintained order. They are grotesque, goblin-like, and they arrive in Homer's basement to make very clear that if Duncan keeps winning, there will be consequences. The episode leans into this completely. The jockey underground is treated as a genuine plot element. Homer has to navigate his horse's racing career while managing threats from a subterranean community of mutant racing professionals. It is absolutely insane. And the episode knows it's absolutely insane, and it seems to think this is funny. And here's where the controversy lives. Right in the middle of this episode, as if the writers were fully aware that what they were doing was a departure from the show's established logic, there is a deliberate piece of meta-commentary. Comic Book Guy, the show's resident critic and stand-in for the demanding fanbase, appears at a horse racing event. He turns to the camera, or as close to turning to the camera as an animated character can get, and he complains that the previous episode about a horse jockey who is also a musician had already done this kind of story, and that the show lacks any sense of originality. The joke is that Comic Book Guy is complaining about a different show doing a similar premise. But the implication, the one that the writing staff clearly understood would land clearly, was that Comic Book Guy was complaining about The Simpsons itself, about its habit of retreading familiar territory, about its willingness to do anything, no matter how absurd, without any grounding in the kind of character logic that had made the show's earlier absurdism feel earned. And then the episode continues, completely undeterred by this self-critique, to feature the mutant jockey underground as a genuine plot element. The fan community did not find this charming. Many found it genuinely infuriating. The self-referential acknowledgement that the episode was doing something lazy or absurd, without any actual change of course, felt to many viewers like the show was acknowledging the criticism and then openly refusing to do anything about it, which is a specific kind of arrogance that audiences don't particularly enjoy. But there's another reading. And it's the reading that makes Saddlesore Galactica more interesting than its reputation suggests. The episode might be genuinely experimenting with a different kind of storytelling. Not character-driven, not emotionally honest, not grounded in the recognizable domestic anxieties that powered the show's best work. Something looser. Something that prioritizes pure comedic invention over narrative coherence. Something closer to the surrealism of programs like Monty Python, where the logic of the sketch is the logic of comedy itself rather than the logic of character psychology. In that context, the mutant jockeys aren't a failure of craft, they're a choice. A choice to abandon the pretense that everything needs to make sense within the show's established reality and to instead commit fully to a premise because it's funny, because the image of subterranean mutant jockeys threatening Homer Simpson in his own basement is intrinsically ridiculous, and the episode knows it and does it anyway. Whether this was the right choice for The Simpsons at that point in its history is a legitimate debate. The show's earlier absurdism, the episodes that went to genuinely strange places, always did so from a foundation of character truth. Homer goes to space in Season 5, and it's completely insane. But the episode is grounded in Homer's genuine desire to prove himself worthy, to be more than he's ever been told he is. The fantasy is attached to something real. The mutant jockeys are attached to nothing except the premise that mutant jockeys are funny. That's the difference. And it's not a small one. What Saddlesore Galactica represents in the larger conversation about the show's decline is a certain willingness to sacrifice internal consistency for a quick comedic payoff. The earlier show earned its absurdism by making you care first. This episode asks you to find the absurdism funny without the emotional groundwork that would make it land the way the earlier surrealism did. There's also a secondary controversy embedded in this episode that sometimes gets overlooked in the conversation about the jockeys. The episode's B-plot involves Lisa competing in a school band competition. She discovers that the winning band cheated and is furious. She brings her concerns to the competition authorities and is essentially told that her concern is noted and nothing will be done. The corrupted outcome stands. This is actually quite good. It's a quiet, low-key piece of storytelling about a kind of injustice that many people encounter in institutions. The discovery that the rules are enforced selectively, that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee the right outcome, and that the people with the power to address the problem often don't have any particular incentive to do so. Lisa's helplessness in the face of institutional indifference is handled with restraint and without a pat resolution. And because the episode is primarily remembered for mutant jockeys, this B-plot barely gets mentioned in the controversy, which is a shame. Because it's a reminder that even in the episodes that went off the rails in one direction, there was often something working, some smaller story being told with real care, in the margins. The Simpsons, at its most compromised, was still capable of grace notes. That's worth remembering. Number. Section 5. That 90s show when the backstory betrayed itself. Season 19, Episode 11. That 90s show. Aired the 27th of January 2008. By Season 19, the conversation about The Simpsons' decline had been going on for more than a decade. The show was no longer in danger of being cancelled. It had long since become an institution, something that would continue to air regardless of its quality, because its brand had transcended any individual season's worth of material. The fan community had largely bifurcated into people who had stopped watching and people who continued watching, while maintaining a clear-eyed awareness that what they were watching was different from what the show had once been. Into this context comes That 90s Show, an episode that committed what many fans considered the most egregious continuity violation in the show's history. And that's saying something, given what we just discussed about Skinner. Here's the problem in its simplest form. The Simpsons had established, across years of flashback episodes and backstory revelations, that Homer and Marge were teenagers in the late 1970s. Their formative years were spent in a specific cultural moment, pre-Reagan, post-Vietnam, the tail end of the counterculture, and the beginning of the Reagan era. Their relationship was anchored in that time. The references, the music, the fashion, the cultural milestones they invoked when discussing their youth, all pointed to the 1970s and very early 1980s as their era. That 90s show erased this completely. The episode depicts Homer and Marge as young adults in the 1990s. Homer is in a grunge band. He has the hair, the flannel, the vague, unkempt aesthetic. He is fully, unmistakably situated in 1990s alternative rock culture. Marge goes to college and almost loses herself to academic pretension and the influence of a pompous, intellectual boyfriend. The pop culture references are all anchored in the decade that produced Nirvana and reality television and the first explosion of the internet into everyday life. The episode is not trying to be subtle about this. It is explicitly, deliberately revising Homer and Marge's history to place it in a different decade. The floating timeline, which had always been the show's method of updating itself without committing to character aging, had usually operated by simply never quite specifying when things happened. That 90s show went further. It actively depicted new history, replacing the old history that fans remembered and cared about with something entirely new. The fan response was volcanic, not because the episode was particularly bad, though its quality is contested. The response was so intense because of what the revision implied. If the writers were willing to relocate Homer and Marge's entire youth to a different decade, to rewrite the foundational backstory of the show's central relationship with this level of casualness, then nothing in the show's history was safe. Any character detail, any established fact, any carefully accumulated piece of the show's mythology could be revised if a writer thought of something that required it. This is the nuclear option of retconning. And the fans who had been with the show since the 1990s, who remembered the episodes that established the original backstory, who had woven those details into their understanding of who these characters were, found it genuinely destabilizing. There's also a quality argument to be made, separate from the continuity one. The comedy of Homer in a grunge band, of Springfield navigating the specific cultural textures of the mid-1990s, is executed with varying degrees of success. Some of the jokes land. Some of them feel like the kind of jokes that a writer makes about a decade rather than in a decade. The difference between authentic period detail and nostalgic pastiche is usually perceptible, and That 90s show sits awkwardly in that zone. What's interesting, though, and what gets lost in the purely continuity-focused argument, is what the episode is trying to do emotionally. At its core, it's a story about Homer and Marge nearly losing each other before they fully found each other, about Homer's pride and his ambition getting in the way of his love, and about Marge's genuine susceptibility to a version of intellectual life that Homer can't offer. It's trying to be a story about how love survives incompatibility, how two people from genuinely different worlds find their way back to each other. That's a real story. That's a story the show has always been capable of telling. The problem is that it required destroying what the show had already established to tell it. And you can't ask an audience to care about the new version of a story if they remember and valued the old version. The specific tragedy of that 90s show is that it damaged the thing it was trying to celebrate. Episodes about Homer and Marge's history, about the origin of their love, work best when they feel like they're revealing something that was always true, adding texture and depth to a backstory that the audience already carries. Homer and Marge's relationship in the 1970s flashbacks had a particular warmth, a particular light. Young Homer, awkward and desperate and genuinely in love with this woman who was so obviously better than his circumstances. Young Marge, trying to figure out what she wanted, and gradually discovering that what she wanted was this strange, earnest, bumbling boy. Those flashbacks felt like discovery, like finding out something you'd always suspected but never had confirmed. That 90s SAS show felt like replacement, like being told that the discovery was wrong and here was a different discovery instead. And no matter how interesting the replacement story might be on its own terms, the act of replacement carries a cost. You don't just lose the original, you lose the feeling of the original. The sense that the story the show has been telling all along has a coherent foundation. That loss is what the controversy is really about. Number, Section 6. Lisa Goes Gaga, The Limits of Sincerity. Season 23, Episode 22, Lisa Goes Gaga, aired the 20th of May, 2012. The Season 23 finale. By Season 23, the show had been running for more than 2 decades. Its relationship with celebrity guest appearances was complicated. In the early seasons, the show's celebrity guests had been integrated into the show's world with a specificity and a self-awareness that made the appearances feel earned. They played characters, or they played exaggerated versions of themselves, but the comedy came from how they fit into Springfield's reality rather than from the fact of their presence alone. By the time we reach Lisa Goes Gaga, the dynamic has shifted considerably. The episode is built entirely around a single celebrity, Lady Gaga, and it spends the majority of its runtime celebrating her and using Lisa as an emotional vehicle for that celebration. Here's what happens. Lady Gaga's tour train passes through Springfield. It is an impossibly elaborate, fantastical train, all light and spectacle and costume changes. Lady Gaga is presented throughout the episode as a kind of benevolent pop goddess, someone so attuned to human suffering that she can detect it from a moving vehicle and redirect her entire tour to address it. The suffering she detects belongs to Lisa. Lisa, who has been voted the least popular student at Springfield Elementary, is in a genuine emotional low point. And Lady Gaga decides of her own volition to befriend Lisa and help her find her confidence. The episode then proceeds to give Lady Gaga essentially everything. She's funny, she's warm, she's wise, she's magical. She can do anything. She is presented as unambiguously wonderful in a way that the show almost never presents real-world figures. The Simpsons has always been willing to puncture celebrity egos, to find the absurdity in fame, to treat its guest stars as material rather than as sacred objects. Lisa Goes Gaga treats Lady Gaga as something approaching sacred. The fan community's response was extremely negative. The episode won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, which made the negative response from fans feel even more bewildering to people outside the fan community who couldn't understand what the fuss was about. The episode was widely reviewed positively by critics. It won an Emmy, and fans were voting it the worst episode in the show's history. The disconnect is real and worth examining. What fans objected to was not Lady Gaga specifically, it was the dynamic the episode established. The Simpsons, at its best, was never a vehicle for sincerely celebrating anything without some degree of critical distance. Even the things the show loved, the things it clearly cared about, were subject to the same comedic scrutiny as everything else. The show's affection was always mixed with irreverence. That combination was part of what made it feel honest. Lisa Goes Gaga is not irreverent toward Lady Gaga. At all. The episode is essentially a tribute, and the problem with a tribute in a comedy context is that tribute requires the comedy to step aside, to make room for the genuineness of the admiration. And when the comedy steps aside, what you're left with is sincerity without the comedic architecture to support it. There's also a Lisa problem embedded in this episode that the controversy doesn't always fully articulate. Lisa's journey in this episode ends with her finding self-acceptance through the attention and validation of a famous person. Lady Gaga helps Lisa see that she is worthy of love and confidence, and this resolution is presented straightforwardly as a good thing. But the Lisa that fans know and love is a character whose self-worth has always been internally generated, sometimes painfully, sometimes heroically. Lisa doesn't need external validation from a pop star. Lisa's whole arc across 20-plus seasons has been about finding and sustaining a sense of self in an environment that doesn't support it, that actively pushes back against it. The show has always been aware of the cost of that, the difficulty of it, the loneliness it requires. An episode that resolves Lisa's isolation through the patronage of a celebrity feels structurally wrong. It's not that Lady Gaga can't care about Lisa. It's that a Lisa who requires a globally famous musician to notice her before she can accept herself is a diminished version of the character. It reduces her from someone who fights for her own dignity to someone who waits to be noticed. The Emmy win complicates the conversation in an interesting way. Awards are not measures of fan satisfaction, and they're not intended to be. The Emmy voters were presumably evaluating the episode on different criteria than the fans were. Technical achievement, production quality, the complexity of the animation, the message, the celebrity collaboration. Evaluated on those criteria, the episode probably does merit recognition. But awards can feel like a statement, like institutional validation of something that the community most invested in the work has rejected. And that gap between what the institutional structures of the television industry recognized as quality and what the fan community recognized as faithful to the show they loved, is itself a kind of commentary on the strange double life the show was living by that point in its history. Too big to fail, too beloved to cancel, continuing to receive external validation even as the internal relationship with its audience was fractured and complicated. What's almost soothing about this episode, revisited at a distance, is the visual spectacle of the Gaga train sequences. They're genuinely beautiful to look at. The design of her costumes and vehicles, the explosion of color and light, has a kind of dreamlike quality that sits well in the late hours. And Gaga's vocal performance is genuinely committed. Whatever your feelings about the episode's relationship to the show's legacy, she was clearly invested in making it work. Number, Section 7. The Boys of Bummer Springfield's Darkest Joke. Season 18, Episode 18, The Boys of Bummer. Aired the 6th of May, 2007. This is the episode that is probably the most genuinely dark thing on our entire list. Not dark in the way that Homer's enemy is dark, where the darkness serves a coherent satirical purpose, dark in the way that makes you genuinely uncertain about whether the show knew what it was doing or whether it had simply miscalibrated so severely that the result was something distressing rather than funny. Here's what happens. The Springfield children's baseball team is in a crucial game. Bart has a chance to make the catch that wins the championship. He drops it, the ball hits the ground. Springfield loses. What follows is one of the most extended, concentrated, and explicit depictions of mob cruelty toward a child in the show's history. The entire town of Springfield turns on Bart for dropping the catch. This is not played for a single episode beat and then moved past. The episode commits to it across its entire runtime. The town mocks him. They paint his name on a water tower and add the word loser. People he knows, people he has grown up with, people who have no particular stake in the baseball game, line up to heap humiliation on him. The episode depicts Bart becoming increasingly, genuinely miserable, losing his sense of self, being systematically torn down by a community that has collectively decided to make him a scapegoat. At one point, Bart attempts to jump from the water tower. This is played for a gag. It does not land as a gag. The episode's defenders argue that this is satire, that the show is depicting the cruelty of small communities, the way they designate scapegoats, and use collective mockery as a social mechanism, that the extremity of the town's reaction is itself the joke, an indictment of mob mentality rather than a celebration of it. The episode's critics argue that you can't satirize cruelty toward a child by depicting it in extended, detailed fashion without any meaningful interruption or challenge to it. That the comedy never quite arrives to redeem what's being shown. That the resolution, where Bart is eventually vindicated when the opposing team's player admits he dropped the ball first, is too late and too small to undo the 40-something minutes of what preceded it. There's a legitimate critical conversation to be had about when a piece of comedy crosses a line from satirizing cruelty to simply depicting it. The Boys of Bummer lands on the wrong side of that line for many viewers, and the landing isn't accidental. The episode is not a lazy piece of work. It's carefully constructed. Every act of cruelty against Bart is deliberate. The escalation is intentional, and that intentionality makes it harder, not easier, to forgive the miscalibration. What the episode needed, and never quite found, was a moment where the comedy of the town's absurd overreaction was clearly and unambiguously funnier than the suffering it was causing, where the satirical frame was strong enough to hold the darkness without letting it seep out and become something genuinely upsetting. The Principal and the Pauper has a satirical frame. Homer's Enemy has a satirical frame. The Boys of Bummer has the skeleton of a satirical frame that isn't quite substantial enough to do the work it needs to do. There's another reading of this episode that requires sitting with it a little longer. If you accept the premise that Springfield is a community defined by collective denial, by the willingness to engage in whatever cruelty the mob consensus demands, and then forget it happened, then The Boys of Bummer is actually a consistent depiction of how that community works. Springfield has always been capable of this. The mob forming against Marge in one episode, the riot at the baseball game in another. The town turning on Homer with predictable regularity whenever it needs someone to blame. What the episode does that the earlier mob episodes didn't is make the target a child, and make the mob's behavior sustained rather than episodic. It holds on the cruelty without releasing the pressure through comedy, and that sustained pressure is what makes it so uncomfortable. Is that discomfort the point? Maybe. Is it successfully executed? Considerably less certain. The episode's final moments, where Marge delivers a clear and justified condemnation of the town's behavior, have a quality that feels more like the show acknowledging it went too far than a satisfying narrative conclusion. It's a statement more than a resolution. But here's what remains. If you can bracket the discomfort of what's being depicted and look at the episode structurally, at the specific mechanics of how a community turns on an individual, there is something honest in it. Something that recognizes a real social pattern. Small communities do designate scapegoats. They do use collective mockery as a way of managing anxiety about failure, transferring it from the community as a whole to a single individual who can absorb it. Bart dropping a ball becomes a vessel for Springfield's anxieties about losing, about inadequacy, about being the kind of town that loses. And rather than sit with that anxiety collectively, the town gives it a name and a face and a water tower and moves on. The episode is not wrong about that. It's just very unpleasant to watch it being right. Section 8. Kill the alligator and run the one that tested everyone. Season 11, Episode 19. Kill the alligator and run. Aired the 30th of April 2000. This episode has the unusual distinction of being voted the worst episode of the entire series by a TV Guide poll. And it has maintained that reputation with considerable consistency in the decades since. Revisiting it now, the question isn't so much whether it's bad, because it is genuinely a chaotic and frustrating piece of television. The question is what kind of bad it is, and what that specific flavor of badness tells us about the show at this particular moment. Here's the setup. Homer takes a quiz in a magazine and becomes convinced, based on the quiz results, that he is going to die in 3 years. This panic sends him into a genuine anxiety spiral, which is actually a rich premise. Homer's relationship with mortality has always been interesting. His fear of death is real. His awareness of how much his family depends on him is real, even if his ability to be consistently responsible for them is limited. But the episode doesn't stay with this premise. Homer, in his anxiety, becomes completely unhinged on a family spring break trip to Florida. He drives the family to a party and proceeds to cause escalating chaos that results, through a series of increasingly absurd circumstances, in the death of an alligator named Captain Albert. This is a local celebrity alligator. Its death results in Homer and the family being arrested, sentenced to perform labor on a chain gang, then escaping, then being chased by the police across Florida, all of which is intercut with a subplot involving Kid Rock and Joe C performing at the spring break party. The Kid Rock and Joe C subplot is the element most frequently cited as the moment the episode loses whatever remaining connection it might have had to anything the show ever cared about. The pair perform. They interact with Bart. The subplot doesn't connect to the main story in any meaningful way. They are there because they were available and willing, and the show thought having them be there was enough. By this point in the show's run, the celebrity guest appearance had become its own distinct form of laziness. In the early seasons, the guest appearance was always in service of a story. When James Brown appeared in Season 2, it was brief and specific and perfectly calibrated to the moment. When Kelsey Grammer first voiced Sideshow Bob, the character was already deeply established, and the guest voice elevated something that existed independently of it. Kill the Alligator and Run uses its guests differently. They exist as an attraction, a reason to watch that has nothing to do with the story the episode is telling, which is itself barely coherent. The fan community's objection is clear. The episode doesn't know what it wants to be. It's too chaotic to work as a character piece about Homer's mortality anxiety. It's too grounded in plot mechanics to work as pure surrealism. It doesn't commit to either its dramatic premise or its comedic extremism. It exists in a middle zone that satisfies neither. And yet there's something I want you to hold on to about this episode. Something that's easier to find when you're watching it late, without the critical apparatus of the fan community telling you what to think about it. The episode opens with Homer genuinely scared. Not cartoon scared, not pratfall scared. Scared in the particular way that middle-aged people get scared when they start doing the math on how much time they might have left and whether they've done anything with it. He's sitting in his living room, having taken this magazine quiz, and the quiz has told him, in the completely irresponsible way that magazine quizzes will, that he's going to die at a specific age. And he believes it. He folds it into his understanding of the world. Homer's relationship with his own mortality has always been one of the show's most quietly poignant threads. He knows he hasn't done great things. He knows he's not what the world would call a success. He knows that his children are, in measurable ways, paying a price for his limitations. And the knowledge that time is finite, that the opportunity to do better has a deadline, is something that genuinely frightens him. The episode loses that thread almost immediately. It gets distracted by plot, by spectacle, by the presence of Kid Rock, but in those opening minutes, before the chaos takes over, there's something real. Something that the show was capable of in its best years and was still occasionally reaching for. The chaos that follows might be read as Homer running from the thing he saw in that opening, distracting himself with spectacle and noise, because sitting with the reality of his own mortality is more than he can manage. Florida becomes a kind of hysteria, a manic attempt to outrun the thought that took hold when he saw the quiz results. That's probably a more generous reading than the episode deserves. But generosity at this hour feels like the right approach. Section 9. Skinner and the Superintendent. Homer versus Dignity, Two Kinds of Wrong. Let's talk about two episodes that generated very different kinds of controversy. Episodes that are usually discussed separately, but that illuminate something interesting when you look at them together. Season 9, Episode 10, Miracle on Evergreen Terrace, and then something from a little later. Season 12, Episode 5, Homer versus Dignity. These are episodes where the show made choices that fans found either genuinely cruel, genuinely lazy, or both. And the debates about them are still alive. But first, let's set a slightly different scene. There's an episode in Season 9 that doesn't usually get mentioned in the worst episode lists, but that, I think, deserves some attention in any conversation about the show's changing relationship with its characters. Season 9, Episode 14, Das Bus. This one is, on paper, a perfectly functional episode. The children of Springfield Elementary are stranded on a deserted island after their school bus runs off a bridge, and the story becomes a Lord of the Flies parody. Lisa tries to maintain order. Bart falls back on his natural charisma to sustain his social position. The other kids devolve towards savagery with predictable speed. What generates the controversy here is subtle. The episode is competently assembled, and the Lord of the Flies reference is clearly telegraphed and executed with reasonable skill. But the parody never quite adds anything to the original. It just maps the structure of Golding's novel onto Springfield Elementary children and plays it for broad comedy. The critics who find the episode frustrating argue that the best Simpsons parodies don't just adapt their source material, they transform it. They use the source material to say something new about Springfield's world, about American culture, about the characters involved. Das Bus uses Lord of the Flies as a template, and doesn't add a layer of meaning that the template itself doesn't already contain. This was becoming a pattern in the later seasons. The show's cultural references, which had always been precise and deployed in service of specific comedic or emotional points, began to feel increasingly like destinations rather than tools. The reference was the joke, rather than the reference being used to make a different joke. Now, Homer vs. Dignity, Season 12, Episode 5, aired the 26th of November 2000. By Season 12, the show was operating in a zone that fans found deeply uncomfortable. The character of Homer had undergone a gradual but significant transformation from his Golden Age version. The Homer of Seasons 3 through 8 was a man of genuine, if frequently suppressed, emotional depth. He loved his family with a completeness that occasionally surprised even him. He had genuine principles that emerged at crucial moments. He was self-destructive and impulsive, and often idiotic, but he was not cruel, and he was not casually degraded for sport. The Homer of Season 12 is sometimes a different creature, and Homer vs. Dignity is one of the episodes most frequently cited as evidence of this shift. The premise: Homer is broke and agrees to work as Mr. Burns' personal jester, humiliating himself on command in exchange for money. This is already precarious territory. Homer's dignity has always been a subject of comedy, but typically the comedy comes from Homer's own choices, his own impulsiveness, his own stubborn refusal to see the consequences of what he's doing until it's too late. When the humiliation comes from an external authority commanding it, the dynamic changes. Homer becomes a victim in a way that the show isn't entirely equipped to handle. But the episode goes further. Homer, in service to Burns' increasingly degrading demands, begins targeting other people. He throws fish at Lenny. He dresses as a giant panda and gets, to put it decorously, violated by an actual panda at a zoo. He dresses in drag during a Thanksgiving parade and shocks the crowd. The panda sequence is the most discussed, and the discussion has never been entirely comfortable. The episode plays it for laughs. Fans have argued for decades about whether it succeeds as comedy, whether it crosses a line that the show shouldn't cross, and whether the degradation it depicts is calibrated correctly for a primetime animated comedy about a family man. What's particularly strange about the episode is that it ends with Homer asserting his dignity and refusing to degrade Marge on Burns' command. This is presented as a redemptive moment. Homer discovers in the moment of refusing that he has something he won't sell. The episode seems to want its conclusion to retroactively justify everything that preceded it. Fans found this unsatisfying. The argument is that you can't put a character through 20-something minutes of genuine, escalating humiliation, including at least one sequence that many viewers found genuinely disturbing, and then declare the episode to be about dignity. The ending doesn't cancel the middle. What Homer vs. Dignity represents in the larger narrative of the show's decline is the specific problem of character assassination through good intentions. The episode wasn't trying to be cruel to Homer. It was trying to tell a story about what Homer values, about what he's willing to protect even when it costs him. But in order to tell that story, it put him through things that undermined the version of Homer that the story was supposed to be celebrating. There's a version of this episode that works. You can see it in outline. Homer, desperate for money, compromises his dignity in ways that start small and escalate, and the audience's sympathy is maintained throughout because the comedy of what he's enduring never becomes simply cruel. And then he draws a line. He finds the thing he won't compromise, and the ending earns its emotional weight because the preceding 20 minutes earned it. The episode that actually aired doesn't quite execute that version. The middle section tips past the point where Homer's suffering reads as comedy rather than cruelty, and once that line is crossed, the redemptive ending can't fully restore what was lost. Let's stay in Season 12 for a moment and acknowledge something that doesn't get said enough in these conversations. Even in the seasons that fans have largely written off as decline years, even in the seasons that produced episodes like Homer vs. Dignity and the various misfires we've been discussing, there were individual moments, sometimes individual episodes, of genuine brilliance. Season 12 gave us Skinner's Sense of Snow, an episode about Springfield Elementary being snowed in that is pure, joyful, beautifully crafted Simpsons comedy. Bart and his fellow prisoners, the children trapped in the school, while Skinner devolves into increasingly baroque discipline regimes. The donuts, the industrial-grade hamster wheel, The specific and perfect comedy of groundskeeper Willie's accent becoming completely impenetrable as the episode progresses. This is the show working at something close to its best. And it aired in the same season as Homer vs. Dignity. The same season. The same writer's room, the same production staff, the same resources, the same basic creative infrastructure that was producing the misfires was also producing genuine excellence. The decline years were never as uniform in their failure as the fan community's retrospective narrative sometimes suggests. This is worth holding onto when we're talking about any of these episodes. The show was not simply running out of ideas or losing the ability to make good television. It was losing consistency. It was making different choices with its creative resources, choices that sometimes resulted in episodes that felt unworthy of the show's legacy, but that didn't eliminate the show's ability to find moments, episodes, sometimes entire runs of episodes, that reminded you exactly why you fell in love with it in the first place. Number. Section 10. Bart to the Future. All about Lisa. When the future became the problem. Season 11, Episode 17. Bart to the Future, aired the 19th of March 2000. This is the prediction episode, the one that launched 1,000 internet posts when Donald Trump became president in 2016. The one that made The Simpsons briefly famous again to a generation who hadn't really been paying attention to it. And its controversy historically has nothing to do with any of that. Its controversy is about what it said about Bart. Here's the premise. Bart, via a vision shown to him by a Native American casino manager, sees his future self. It is not an encouraging vision. Bart at 39 is a feckless, mildly talented, largely unsuccessful musician. He lives in a communal house with other failed creative types. He has a gentle charm and a complete absence of conventional achievement. He is, in this future, precisely the person that his trajectory always threatened to produce. Someone who never quite found a reason to turn his enormous personality into anything lasting. Lisa, in this same future, is President of the United States. She inherits a budget in crisis from her predecessor, identified in a throwaway line as President Trump. She is serious. She is capable. She is everything Bart is not. The fan community's reaction to this episode had two components. The first was the prediction, which we can set aside for now because in the year 2000, it registered only as a fairly good topical joke about the absurdity of celebrity politics. The second was the Bart problem. Fans had been watching Bart for 11 seasons. They had seen him struggle academically, struggle socially, struggle with every institutional framework he was placed inside. They had also seen him show genuine kindness, genuine creativity, genuine intelligence in the specific way that Bart has always been intelligent, which is spatial, immediate, instinctive, not the kind that schools measure, but the kind that solves problems in real time. Bart is not a fool. He is not stupid. He is someone whose skills don't match the institutions he's embedded in. The Bart of the future in this episode is played as a warm, harmless loser. And the fan community reacted to that because it felt like the show had given up on him, had decided that the arc his character was always implicitly on, the arc of finding something he's genuinely good at and building a life around it, was not the arc he would complete. There's a counter-argument that the episode is being honest rather than hopeless, that not every kid who struggles in school becomes a success story. That there is a version of Bart, the most probable version given everything we know about him, who doesn't find the thing that unlocks him and who lands in exactly this kind of gentle, drifting adulthood. And that depicting this with warmth rather than cruelty is actually a kind of grace. But it doesn't sit right with fans who had invested in Bart's potential, who believed across 11 seasons that the show was suggesting that under the troublemaking and the impulsiveness and the institutionalized failure, there was something that would eventually find its form. The episode tells you, maybe not. Season 19, Episode 11, All About Lisa, comes at The Simpsons from a different angle. This is the episode about Lisa becoming a star, about her talent being recognized and celebrated, and about what happens to her character when she finally has the attention she's always desperately wanted. It's an episode about how getting what you always wanted can be as complicated as not having it. Lisa becomes Krusty's assistant, then gradually replaces him, then becomes a star in her own right. And what the episode is watching, with quiet attentiveness, is the way that ambition and recognition can change a person. Lisa, who has always defined herself by her principles, by her resistance to the mainstream, by her outsider status, becomes someone different when the mainstream finally opens up to include her. The controversy here is smaller and more specific than the rancor generated by That 90s Show or The Principal and the Pauper. Fans found the episode to be a reasonable piece of television that was slightly underdeveloped, that touched on something interesting without fully committing to the exploration. Lisa's corruption by fame, such as it is, resolves too cleanly. The episode gets interested in a version of Lisa who has compromised herself for attention and then doesn't fully investigate that version. But there's something in the episode that stays with me. The image of Lisa on stage, finally getting the recognition she has always needed, and the specific quality of discomfort that the episode creates around that recognition. The suggestion that what she wanted wasn't quite what she thought she wanted, that the audience's attention is not the same thing as being genuinely understood. Lisa's longing in the show has always been partly about being seen accurately, not just noticed, but recognized. The difference between a crowd applauding and a single person saying, "I see exactly who you are, and it is good," is a difference the show has always understood. All About Lisa puts Lisa in front of the crowd and quietly asks whether that's enough. The episode doesn't fully answer the question, but the asking is real. Section 11. The Great Wife Hope, Marge in Chains, When Marge Became the Story. Season 21, Episode 3, The Great Wife Hope, aired the 11th of October 2009. Marge Simpson is, by the measure of the cultural conversation the show generates, one of the most undervalued characters in the series. The show's discourse has always circled around Homer's emotional journey, Lisa's intellectual development, Bart's persistent rebellion, and the various villains and supporting characters of Springfield. Marge is often, in this conversation, the foundation rather than the subject, the stable thing that everything else is built on. This is both accurate and slightly unjust, because Marge's story, when the show chooses to tell it, has always been one of the most genuinely interesting things the show does. The Great Wife Hope is an episode that tries to tell Marge's story in a very specific way. It positions her as a crusader against MMA, the mixed martial arts culture that has taken hold in Springfield. Marge is disgusted by the violence. She campaigns against it, and she finds herself, through a series of escalating challenges to her position, backed into a corner where she has to either fight a professional MMA fighter or back down. She fights, and the episode resolves like many late-era Simpsons episodes about social topics, by being mostly inert rather than taking a real position. It's against MMA in the way that television is usually against things. Loudly at first, then quietly, then not really at all by the end. The controversy around this episode is less fierce than some others on our list, but the fan response to it is emblematic of a larger problem with Marge in the later seasons. Marge's crusades, her moral positions, her instinct to improve Springfield had always been treated by the show with a specific kind of complicated respect. The show would show her being right about something, and also show her the cost of being right. The cost of caring more than the people around you about something they've decided not to care about. The loneliness of the crusader, in a community that prefers comfort to improvement. By season 21, Marge's crusades were being handled more simply. She is right. The thing she's against is bad. There's some comedy of escalation, a resolution that doesn't quite resolve. Move on. The complexity was gone. And with the complexity went the emotional resonance that made Marge's episodes meaningful. Let's go further back. Season 4, Episode 19. Marge in Chains, aired the 6th of May, 1993. This is early Simpsons, safely within the golden era, and its controversy is different from everything else we've discussed tonight. This episode's reputation was shaped not by what it did to the characters or the mythology, but by a single joke that became one of the most controversial moments in the show's history. Here's the setup. Marge, exhausted and overwhelmed, accidentally shoplifts a bottle of bourbon from the Quickie Mart by walking out with it in her hands while she was distracted. She is arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to community service. The episode is largely about Springfield's reaction to Marge's crime, the way the community turns on her, and the way justice in Springfield is applied with the same inconsistency and arbitrariness that defines everything else in the town. It's a good episode, one of the better ones from season 4. And then there's the Osaka flu. In the episode, Springfield experiences an outbreak of flu that originated in Japan. The disease spreads through a juicer that has been sent to thousands of American households by a Japanese company. The joke is that a Japanese worker who was sick sneezed into the boxes as they went through the factory, and the Osaka flu arrived in Springfield inside a consumer product. In the original broadcast, this registered as a mildly off-color joke about intercultural transmission of disease, the kind of joke the show made regularly about everything and everyone. It played as satire of American consumer culture's global dependencies, of the way the modern supply chain connects distant strangers in ways they never anticipated. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, this episode and this joke became the subject of enormous renewed attention. The episode was shared widely on social media as a piece of eerie prediction, another entry in the Simpsons Predicted It file, and simultaneously, the joke itself was criticized as contributing to anti-Asian sentiment during a period when anti-Asian violence was rising in America and elsewhere. The controversy around this episode in 2020 is a specific kind of thing, a piece of art encountering a historical moment that it was not designed for and being evaluated by that moment's standards. The joke was made in 1993. The world it was made in and the world it was being watched in were not the same world. The conversation around it in 2020 was not really about what the joke was in 1993. It was about what the joke meant in a world where the context had changed so dramatically around it. This is a genuinely complicated critical situation. It raises questions about how we evaluate older works of art when the world changes around them, when things that were once read as innocuous or satirical acquire new resonances that make them harder to encounter with the same neutrality. There's no simple answer. But the question is a real one, and Marge in Chains sits at the center of it. What's actually lovely about Marge in Chains, setting aside the controversy and the pandemic retrospective, is how carefully it handles Marge herself. The episode is fundamentally about what happens when a good person, a genuinely good person, makes a small mistake in a society that isn't particularly interested in context or proportion when assigning blame. Marge is guilty of what she's charged with. She did take the bourbon without paying, and she is also completely understandable in her guilt. She was exhausted. She was overwhelmed. She was doing the invisible labor that keeps the Simpson household functioning, the labor that nobody acknowledges or compensates, and in her exhaustion she had a momentary lapse. Springfield's response is disproportionate. Of course it is. Springfield's responses to everything are disproportionate. But the disproportionality here is played with unusual sensitivity. The episode is genuinely interested in the gap between what Marge did and what the community decides it means about who Marge is. And in that gap, in the space between the mistake and the verdict, there's something true and a little painful about how public perception of private people works. The community sees Marge Simpson, person of shoplifting incident, and temporarily forgets Marge Simpson, the woman who has held a family and a neighborhood together through decades of chaos. The single failure eclipses the entire history of genuine goodness, and Marge endures it, with the specific kind of quiet dignity that has always been her defining characteristic. She doesn't rage, she doesn't collapse, she serves her community service, does her time, and comes out the other side with her fundamental Margeness intact. That's who Marge is. And whatever the controversies around the show's later handling of her character, the early seasons understood her in a way that makes those episodes still beautiful to revisit. Number section 12. The controversy that time makes later-era episodes and what they're really about. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. We've been to Season 8 and Season 23, to episodes that fans love to hate and episodes that fans quietly mourned. And I want to spend this final section stepping back from the individual controversies and looking at what they have in common, what the pattern is, what the controversy is actually about when you strip away the specific complaint about any given episode, because the argument about any particular Simpsons episode is almost never really about that episode. It's about what the episode means for the show as a whole. It's about whether the show still knows what it is, whether it still cares about these characters in the specific way that made caring about these characters worthwhile. The question underneath every controversy is this still The Simpsons? Let's talk about a few more episodes that circle this question from different angles. Season 22, Episode 12, Homer the Father, aired the 6th of February 2011. This episode, taken in isolation, is a mildly amusing piece of television about Homer developing a habit of consulting a 1980s sitcom father for parenting advice. It's the kind of episode that would have been entirely unremarkable in Season 15. The comedy of Homer's parenting being shaped by television parenting tropes is functional if not inspired. What makes it notable is the subplot. Bart, needing money for a dirt bike, accepts a job as a spy for China, passing along classified information he discovers while snooping through Homer's work documents from the nuclear plant. This subplot is bizarre in the specific way that many late-era Simpsons subplots are bizarre. It's not connected to any emotional reality the characters inhabit. It escalates without internal logic, and it resolves by disappearing rather than concluding. The controversy around the episode, such as it is mostly a shrug. It's the specific variety of controversy that comes not from anger but from indifference. The fan response is less "you betrayed us" and more "we expected more than this." The gap between what the show was and what it was producing had, by season 22, been present long enough that many fans had adjusted their expectations downward. The anger of the early decline years had softened into a kind of resigned disappointment. This is, in its way, a sadder response than the fury that greeted the principal and the pauper. Because the fury was still invested. The fury was still paying attention, still caring enough to be hurt. The shrug of Homer the father is the response of an audience that has partially let go. Season 25, Episode 21, PayPal, aired the 11th of May 2014. This is an episode that deserves more attention than it gets, not because it's particularly controversial, but because it represents something the later show managed to do occasionally that demonstrated the show's capabilities hadn't disappeared, just become less consistent. The episode is about Marge making a new friend, a woman named Pamela who seems, on paper, like the friend Marge has always needed. Someone smart and capable and genuinely interested in Marge as a person rather than as a function. Someone who sees her. The reveal, when it comes, is that Pamela has a complicated relationship with Marge's friendship that involves her own insecurities about money and class, and the episode handles this with a surprising degree of maturity. The conversation about what friendships between women in different economic circumstances can look like, about how money creates invisible walls, and how those walls can coexist with genuine affection, is territory that the show navigated with real care. Marge's emotional world in this episode is drawn with the kind of specificity that characterized her golden era episodes. Her longing for connection that isn't mediated by her role as wife and mother. Her vulnerability to a friend who seems to understand her. Her resilience when that understanding turns out to be more complicated than it appeared. This episode didn't generate controversy. It was barely noticed in the broader conversation about the show's quality. And maybe that's precisely the point. The show could still do this. Could still find something true and handle it with delicacy and craft. It just couldn't do it consistently, couldn't guarantee it episode to episode, and the inconsistency had trained the audience not to expect it. There's an episode from season 14 that I want to bring into the conversation before we close, because it sits at the center of the show's most persistent debate. The question of when Flanderization became complete. Season 14, Episode 16. 3 Gays of the Condo. Aired the 13th of April 2003. The episode begins with something genuinely interesting. Homer discovers a love letter that Marge wrote to another man during a period early in their marriage, and the revelation sends him into a genuine emotional crisis. The question the episode raises is real and worth exploring. What would it mean to discover that your partner, at some point in your shared history, had considered choosing someone else? Homer moves out. He ends up in a gay neighborhood, condo sharing with 2 gay men named Grady and Julio. And the episode spends its second and third acts in this situation, with Homer navigating a social world he's unfamiliar with and finding, to his surprise, that it suits him in certain ways. The gay roommate plot has been criticized over the years for its handling of queer characters, specifically for a sequence involving Homer and Grady that some viewers found homophobic even in its attempt at inclusivity. This criticism is legitimate. The episode's portrayal of its gay characters sometimes falls into the kind of comfortable stereotype that the show's earlier guest characters had specifically avoided. But the emotional core of the episode, the thing that gets underplayed in this conversation, is the Homer and Marge story. The discovery of the letter. Homer's genuine devastation. The way the episode treats the possibility that a marriage can survive the knowledge that one partner once considered leaving. The resolution, which returns Homer and Marge to each other, is earned not by explaining away the letter, but by demonstrating that what they have between them is sufficient to absorb the revelation. That's actually quite sophisticated, And it lands because, even in season 14, the show's understanding of Homer and Marge's relationship retained some of the depth from the earlier years. The marriage was still real. The love was still visible. The episode remembered who these people were to each other, even while surrounding them with a plot that was lighter and less grounded than the marriage story deserved. What I find myself thinking about, in the quiet after reviewing all of these episodes, all of these controversies, all of this sustained passion from a fan community that has been arguing about a cartoon show for 35 years, is what it says about the show that it generated this much feeling. Bad television doesn't generate this kind of sustained controversy. Bad television gets watched briefly, judged quickly, and forgotten. The arguments about The Simpsons have never been forgotten. They have been revisited, refined, sustained, passed on to new viewers who then joined the argument themselves. The show that produced Homer's Enemy and The Principal and The Pauper and Saddlesore Galactica and That 90s Show and Lisa Goes Gaga is not a show that people are indifferent to. The intensity of the negative reaction is itself a form of love. A love that has been tested and complicated and sometimes disappointed, but a love that has never quite gone away. That's remarkable. Genuinely remarkable. Most things don't get that. Let's talk about the decline narrative itself, because the decline narrative is itself a kind of controversy that deserves examination. The idea that The Simpsons peaked around season 8 or 9 and has been in decline ever since is so thoroughly embedded in the discourse that it functions almost as received wisdom. Casual viewers accept it. Critics cite it. The fan community treats it as historical fact. But the decline narrative, taken too literally, obscures something. It obscures the fact that the show in its later seasons was still capable of excellent work. It obscures the fact that the episodes of seasons 10 through 25, taken individually rather than measured against the golden era, are often better than their reputation suggests. It obscures the fact that some of the episodes most frequently cited as low points of the show are more interesting, more genuinely ambitious, more worth examining than the dismissal of them implies. The narrative of decline is accurate as a description of consistency. The later show was, episode for episode, less reliable than the earlier show. The golden era seasons produced extraordinary episodes at a rate that the later seasons couldn't match. That's true. But the narrative of decline as a description of total failure is less accurate. The show that produced the horrible misfires also produced moments of genuine clarity, small scenes in bad episodes where a character said something true, episodes in declining seasons that were beautiful, moments where you remembered exactly why you love these people in this town, even in seasons that had otherwise largely lost the thread. The controversies we've discussed tonight are the evidence for the decline narrative. They're the cases the prosecution presents. But the defense has evidence too. And the defense's evidence is every moment of grace in the bad seasons, every spark of the original thing, every episode that surprised you by being better than you expected it to be. The truth is somewhere between the two positions. And it's a more complicated and more interesting truth than either side of the fan debate usually acknowledges. Season 26, Episode 5, Opposites A Frack, aired the 9th of November 2014. This is an episode about fracking in Springfield, and it features a romance between Mr. Burns and a character who represents his ideological opposite. It is a mildly political episode in a season that was being mildly political more often than the earlier seasons had been, and it is not particularly successful. But what it represents in the show's history is something worth naming. By season 26, the show was no longer capable of generating the same intensity of negative reaction that The Principal and The Pauper had produced. The audience had adjusted. The expectations had recalibrated. What would have been a crisis in season 9 registered in season 26 as just another episode that didn't quite work. This is both a good and a bad thing. It's good because it freed the show from the enormous psychological burden of being measured against its peak every single week. Bad because it also meant the audience had stopped expecting the show to be capable of its peak. And an audience that has stopped expecting something from you has also stopped paying the kind of close attention that made the early controversies so fierce and so generative. The show in its later years operated in a different kind of relationship with its audience than the show in its peak years. Neither worse nor better, exactly. Different. The intimacy was different. The stakes were different. There's a season 17 episode that I want to mention briefly before we approach the close. Season 17, Episode 4, Treehouse of Horror 16th. aired the 6th of November 2005. This isn't strictly a controversial episode. The Treehouse of Horror specials have always been celebrated rather than contested, existing outside the show's canonical reality, and therefore exempt from the continuity-based arguments that power most of the other controversies we've discussed. But I mention it because there's a moment in one of its segments, a parody of a specific style of reality television hunting game, that captures something the show had been trying to capture for years in its regular episodes without quite finding it. The segment works the way the best golden-era Simpsons worked. The satirical target is precisely identified. The comedy is specific enough to be genuinely funny rather than generically observational, and the characters behave in ways that are both absurd and completely consistent with who they are. It's a reminder of the machinery, a reminder that the machine was still there, still capable of firing on all its original cylinders. It just didn't always choose to. Number. Section 13. What controversy teaches us Springfield in the long view? We've been in Springfield for a long time tonight, moving through the episodes that divided audiences, listening to the arguments, looking at what was actually happening inside the controversies, underneath the surface complaints about character choices and continuity violations and celebrity appearances and tonal miscalibrations. And what I keep coming back to, as we reach the end of this journey through the more turbulent parts of Springfield's history, is a simple observation. The controversy follows the love. Every single debate we've examined tonight, from the mild discomfort of the secret war of Lisa Simpson, to the furious rejection of the principal and the pauper, to the bewildered disappointment of that '90s show, to the quiet shrug of Homer, the father, has been powered by something the show generated in its best years and then tried to sustain. An attachment to these characters, a genuine investment in their inner lives. A sense that Springfield is a real place with real stakes, that what happens to Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie actually matters. That's what the show created. And the controversies are the evidence that it created it successfully, because you cannot be furious about what happens to fictional people unless you have been made to believe, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that they are real, that what happens to them means something. The principal and the pauper generated one of the most intense fan reactions in television history, not because the episode was particularly evil or cynically produced. It generated that reaction because the fan community had spent 6.5 seasons believing in Seymour Skinner, and the episode asked them to stop, asked them to accept that what they believed was never real was always a construction, and that the construction could be replaced by a different construction without loss. And the fans said, no, that's not how it works. What we built together, the show and its audience, across 6.5 seasons of carefully accumulated character detail, is real in the way that fictional things can be real. You cannot erase it by decree. You cannot replace it with a new story and expect us not to mourn the old one. That mourning is the controversy, and the controversy is, at its root, a love letter. What does it mean that The Simpsons, a cartoon that has been on television since 1989, still generates this kind of feeling? Still produces arguments, still divides communities, still has people staying up until 3 in the morning rewatching episodes from 1997 and arguing about what they mean? It means the show did something that very few pieces of art in any medium have managed to do. It created a world that people believed in, a world with enough internal consistency, enough emotional truth, enough accumulated history and texture and specificity that it functioned not just as entertainment but as a reference point, a place that people carry around in their heads and return to when they need to think about something. Something that gave them a language for experiences and feelings and relationships that they couldn't otherwise articulate quite as precisely. Springfield is not real. The Simpsons are not real. And yet, the specific anxiety of being overlooked the way Lisa is overlooked is real. The specific exhaustion of Marge's invisible labor is real. The specific grief of Homer's stunted potential is real. The specific cruelty of a community that designates its scapegoats and enforces its consensus is real. The specific sadness of Ned Flanders, doing everything right in a world that doesn't reward rightness, is real. The show mapped these real things onto cartoons and put them on television for 36 years. And somewhere in the process of watching, across seasons of varying quality and decades of changing cultural context, the audience absorbed the map, internalized it, started using it to navigate. That's what the controversies are protecting. Not any specific episode or any specific character choice. The map, the framework, the version of the world that the show built. There's an episode from season 29 that I want to close with, because it speaks directly to this. Season 29, episode 13. 3 scenes plus a tag from a marriage. Aired the 11th of February 2018. The episode revisits Homer and Marge's early marriage from 3 different perspectives, 3 scenes from a period of time that the show has touched on but never fully explored. The premise is simple, and the execution is careful. It's an episode that knows exactly what it's doing. It's going back to the source of the show's emotional power, back to the moment before the mythology was established, and looking at how 2 people become a family. The comedy is gentler than it might be in an earlier season. The writing doesn't have the same density as the golden era Simpsons. But the emotional truth is intact. Homer and Marge, young and broke and in love and scared, and trying to figure out how to make a life together, are recognizable. They are themselves. And the episode is content to let them be themselves without requiring them to do anything particularly spectacular. By season 29, this was itself a kind of achievement. The ability to do nothing spectacular and still be true to who these characters are. Still know who they are. The show had survived the controversies, had survived the decline narrative, had survived the audience's renegotiation of its expectations. And it was still, in its 29th season, capable of this. Of a quiet episode about 2 people at the beginning of their life, together, handled with care and honesty and the specific warmth that has always been the show's most valuable quality. Let's think about Homer for a moment. Not the Homer of the controversial episodes, not the Homer of Homer versus Dignity, or Kill the Alligator and Run, or the various misfires we've cataloged tonight. The Homer underneath all of that? The one who was always there, even when the episodes failed to find him. Homer Simpson is a man who loves his family so completely that he can't quite express it without breaking it. He reaches for them and knocks things over. He tries to do something right and produces something catastrophic. He means better than he does. He is more than his worst moments, and his worst moments are very bad. And yet, he comes home. Every episode, through every catastrophe and every reset and every controversy and every decade of varying quality, Homer comes home. To Marge, to Bart, to Lisa, to Maggie in her crib. He comes through the door at 5:30, and something about the familiarity of that moment, the sound of it, the shape of it, is enough to make the day feel worth it. That's the image the show keeps returning to, because it's the image that carries all the weight of what the show has always been trying to say. That ordinary life, domestic life, the life of a working-class family in a cartoon town that doesn't exist anywhere on any map is worth something. That the daily accumulation of ordinary moments, dinners and arguments and homework and beer and television, and all the small textures of an unremarkable life constitutes something real and valuable and worth preserving. The controversies push against this because they threaten to disrupt it. They change the characters or erase their histories or replace their personalities with something that doesn't recognize what came before. And the fan community pushes back because they understand, even if they don't always articulate it in quite these terms, that what they're defending is the image, the family, the house, the life. Homer coming home. Over and over. Through 36 seasons of varying quality and uneven consistency and occasional brilliance and periodic catastrophic failure, coming home. We've been in Springfield a long time tonight. The town is quiet now, or as quiet as it ever gets. The nuclear plant hums in the distance. The lights are on at the Flanders house, because Ned is always up, always praying, always finding something to do with the energy that his conditioning won't let him discharge any other way. Moe's Tavern is technically closed, but nobody's told Barney. The Quick E-Mart is open because it is always open. And on Evergreen Terrace, the lights in the Simpson house are mostly off. Marge has gone to bed, the kids are asleep. Homer is on the couch, half watching television, doing the specific thing Homer does better than anyone, existing in the moment without catastrophizing it or improving it or trying to make it something other than what it is. He's just here. The television is on. The house is still around him. His family is in it. Whatever the show has been through, whatever the controversies have said about its quality or its faithfulness to its own mythology or its treatment of characters we spent years loving, whatever the seasons of varying achievement and the decades of arguments and the fan polls and the critical reassessments, whatever all of that means, Homer is on the couch. And that's enough. Number? Section 2. The Principal and the Pauper, the episode that changed the contract. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper, aired the 28th of September, 1997. This is the one. This is the episode that Simpsons fans cite more than almost any other when they are trying to explain what happened to the show. When they want to pinpoint the moment when the relationship between the show and its audience began to change, when the trust that had been building across 6.5 careful seasons of honest storytelling started to crack, this is where they point. It divided everything into before and after. And it did so in the second episode of the new season. Not at the end, not at the beginning, not tucked into the middle where it might have been absorbed more easily. The second episode, the show was announcing itself. To understand the weight of what this episode did, you have to understand who Seymour Skinner was before it aired. Not the Armin Tamzarian version, the character the audience actually knew. Skinner entered the show's world as a type, the officious, rule-bound school administrator who has no life outside his institution, a man defined entirely by his title. He was, in those earliest appearances, a functional obstacle in Bart's various schemes. He was the system. He was the establishment. He existed to be outwitted and to be embarrassed when he was. But then the show did what it did brilliantly throughout its golden years. It found the human being inside the archetype, and the human being it found was genuinely interesting. The Skinner that emerged through seasons 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 was a man shaped by trauma in ways the show handled with unusual care. His service in Vietnam, where he had been a prisoner of war and experienced things he rarely spoke of directly, ran underneath his behavior like a buried current. It surfaced in his extreme need for control, in his discomfort with ambiguity, in the way he handled the daily chaos of elementary school administration through systems of rule and procedure that were, at their root, a way of managing the unmanageable. He had come back from Vietnam carrying things that did not simplify over time. His relationship with Agnes was a whole comedy universe contained in 2 characters. Agnes was demanding, critical, fiercely present in his life in a way that left almost no room for the life he might have constructed apart from her. She was also, in her way, genuinely devoted to him. The devotion and the suffocation were inseparable. Skinner navigated this with the specific blend of love and exhaustion that people who are too close to their parents in adulthood know well. He had never quite achieved the escape velocity that would have let him build a separate life. He stayed, and the staying was not only weakness, it was also love. His feeling for Edna Krabappel accumulated across years of small moments. Looks across the teacher's lounge. Brief exchanges in the hallway with an extra beat of silence at the end. 2 people who were aware of each other, who knew something was there, who were managing it rather than acting on it, for reasons that neither of them ever quite articulated. The relationship was never the main subject of any episode, but it was always present, building in the margins. One of the many threads of accumulated meaning that gave Springfield its texture. And the war with Bart? The ongoing battle of wills between a man who represented every institutional constraint Bart could not accept, and a boy who represented every chaotic force the institution existed to contain. This was not simple. It was not purely adversarial. There was something that each of them recognized in the other. Something about rigidity and wildness that each of them needed in some obscure way to be defined against. All of this had been built across 6.5 seasons. A character with a history and an interior life, and a set of relationships that the audience had watched develop with the specific kind of patient attention that long-form storytelling rewards. The investment was real. The Principal and the Pauper made the investment worthless in 42 minutes. Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary is celebrating the 20th anniversary of Principal Skinner's tenure. There is a party, a cake, the warmth of a community gathering around someone who has served it for 2 decades. And then a stranger walks in through the gymnasium doors. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a Vietnam veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war, who survived the camp, who escaped, who came home to America expecting to find his life waiting for him, and discovered instead that someone else had been living it for 20 years. The man Springfield has known as Skinner has a real name, Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, he was nothing. A street punk with no family, no future, no identity that felt like anything worth holding on to. He got drafted. He served alongside the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian went to Springfield to find Skinner's mother and deliver the news. Agnes saw him and assumed he was Seymour. She needed him to be Seymour. And Tamzarian, who had never been needed by anyone, who had never had a mother or a home or a name that mattered, took the assumption and wore it. He became Seymour Skinner. He stepped into a dead man's life and lived there for 20 years. He built a career in it. He built relationships in it. He gave something real to the school and the community. And now the real Skinner is standing in the gymnasium, and the truth is fully and publicly exposed. The episode knows this is interesting territory. A man so emptied by a life without belonging that he would steal a dead man's identity just to feel wanted. There is a real story there. Rich, complicated, worth telling. The episode does not quite tell it. It tells a comedy version of the story that does not fully commit to either the comedy or the drama. It keeps reaching for the emotional weight of what it is depicting and then cutting away to a joke. The jokes undercut the moments that might have been genuine. Tamzarian becomes a figure of uncomfortable pity rather than a person we understand. The real Skinner, the man whose identity was stolen, is played as a nuisance rather than a presence with genuine stakes. The episode cannot decide what it owes to either of them. And then the ending arrives. Springfield holds a town meeting. The truth is on the table. Everyone in the room knows everything, and the town votes. They vote on whether to acknowledge what is real or to maintain what is comfortable. They vote for the comfortable lie. Unanimously, Judge Snyder issues a decree. Armin Tamzarian is Seymour Skinner, legally and permanently. The real Seymour Skinner is banned from Springfield. Under penalty of torture, the name Armin Tamzarian is never to be spoken again. And the actual Skinner is tied to a railroad car and shipped out of town. The episode ends. Next week, everything is exactly as it was. Harry Shearer spoke publicly about his unhappiness with this episode. He said it fundamentally disrespected a character that he and the writing staff had spent years developing. He was right about the disrespect. The audience knew it too, which is why the reaction was so immediate and so sustained. On fan polls and ranked lists, The Principal and the Pauper has sat at or near the bottom of the show's history for nearly 3 decades. It is consistently voted the worst episode ever made, not because it is the most technically inept, but because of what it means. What it means is this: the backstory you believed in was a fiction within the fiction. The character you loved was never who you thought. The investment you made across 6.5 seasons was investment in something the show could dissolve at will. And having dissolved it, the show had Springfield vote to pretend the dissolution never happened, made the truth illegal, and expelled the inconvenient evidence from the community. This is the thing that fans could not forgive. Not the bad episode, the signal the episode sent that the show was willing to do this. That no character, no accumulated history, no relationship between the show and its audience was safe from this kind of revision. And yet when I watch it now, in the quiet of this hour, I find something that the purely critical reading misses. What Springfield does in that town meeting is true. It is one of the truest things the show ever depicted about how communities actually function. It is just that the truth is about something deeply uncomfortable. Springfield has always chosen the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable reality. This is the town that pulled a 3-eyed fish from its water supply and did not test the water. This is the town that watched Burns block out the sun and responded with a lawsuit rather than a revolution. This is the town that experiences catastrophes of genuinely world-altering scale and wakes up the following week having forgotten everything. The reset button has always been there. The collective amnesia has always been real. The Principal and the Pauper is the only episode that shows you the mechanism operating explicitly. In every other reset, the forgetting happens between episodes. In the white space, unexamined. Here, you watch the vote. You hear the decree. You see the exile. The machinery that usually runs invisibly is suddenly visible, completely lit up, and it is grotesque. This might be the point. This might be the show saying, in the starkest possible terms, something true about how communities protect themselves from realities that would require changing. Not through violence, not through obvious suppression, but through consensus. Through the vote that everyone already knows the outcome of before it happens. Through the legal authority that formalizes what the community has already decided, through the physical removal of the person whose existence constitutes the inconvenient truth. The real Seymour Skinner is not just a character in a storyline, he is the truth. And Springfield's response to the truth is the show's most explicit statement of what Springfield has always been. A community that cannot afford to remember. Whether the episode intended this reading or stumbled into it is ultimately unknowable. But the reading is there. And it sits in the episode like something the episode itself cannot quite face, cannot quite look at directly, has to keep cutting away from with jokes and comic deflation. The controversy around the principal and the pauper has never fully resolved. It is the kind of wound that stays. And the wound's persistence is itself informative. It tells you how much the audience had invested in what was taken from them, which is to say, a great deal, more than they perhaps knew until the moment it was gone. What the episode did to the audience's relationship with the show in the seasons that followed is measurable and real. The wariness it created colored the reception of everything that came after it in Season 9. Episodes that might have landed differently in a different context arrived carrying the weight of what had already happened. The audience was watching with a protective alertness it had not needed before, not relaxing into the comedy the same way, not trusting the emotional beats with the same openness. Always, somewhere in the back of the mind, aware that the show had proved it was willing to do that. This is the legacy of the principal and the pauper. Not the bad episode. Bad episodes come and go. The changed relationship. The moment the audience stopped fully trusting the show with the things they loved. And once that trust was compromised, it colored everything afterward, made the good episodes feel less certain, and the bad episodes feel more confirming of fears that were already present. The show would never quite recover this trust from its most devoted viewers. Not because it did not sometimes earn it back, temporarily, in specific episodes or seasons, but because the knowledge that the show was capable of that level of revision was now permanent. The audience carried it. Number Section 3. Homer's Enemy, The Savage Self-Portrait. Season 8, Episode 23. Homer's Enemy. Aired the 5th of April 1997. We need to spend more time here than we have, because this episode is the most formally interesting piece of self-criticism in the show's history, and the controversy it generated, the controversy about whether the show should have made it at all, is still unresolved in ways that make it worth sitting with at length. The episode arrives in Season 8, comfortably inside the golden era, and its reception was complicated from the beginning. Critical response was strong. The episode is tightly constructed, precisely acted, and conceptually bold in ways that the show's critics recognized as exceptional. Fan response was more divided. Some fans loved it immediately. Others found it deeply unpleasant in ways they struggled to fully articulate. To understand both responses, you have to understand what the episode is actually doing. Frank Grimes is a real person inside a cartoon world. This sounds like a simple statement, but its implications are enormous. The Simpsons has always operated with a specific kind of internal logic that allows Homer to survive things that would kill a real person, allows Springfield to function in ways that would be impossible in an actual small city, allows the characters to move through their world with a cartoon durability that is part of the show's fundamental premise. Frank Grimes does not have this durability. He is the representative of actual reality inside Springfield's protected fiction. He operates by the rules of the world outside. He has worked hard for everything he has. He has faced real consequences for real mistakes. He has built his life through actual effort and is justifiably proud of what that effort has produced. And then he is placed next to Homer. Homer, who has never worked hard for anything. Homer, whose job he has held for 3 decades through a combination of luck and the show's fundamental commitment to his survival. Homer, who eats donuts during meltdown warnings and falls asleep at his desk and has caused several near catastrophes and continues to be employed because the show needs him to continue to be employed. Homer, who has a house and a family and a life that is better than Grimes's life by essentially every material measure, despite Homer having done essentially nothing to deserve it. The episode watches Grimes try to process this. It gives him time. It follows the arc of his reaction from mild professional irritation through growing disbelief into genuine psychological breakdown. Each new discovery of Homer's impossible good fortune stacks on the previous one. Homer wins a children's architectural contest by submitting drawings that look like they were made by a child who is also Homer. Homer is photographed with Gerald Ford. Homer is treated with casual warmth by colleagues who work alongside him every day and have apparently stopped noticing that he regularly nearly destroys the facility they all work in. Grimes's breakdown is both the funniest thing and the most uncomfortable thing in the episode, because the comedy comes not from Grimes being wrong about Homer but from Grimes being completely, undeniably right. Every specific thing Grimes identifies as evidence of Homer's undeserved success is accurate. There is no misunderstanding here. Homer is exactly what Grimes says he is. The world has rewarded Homer in ways it has not rewarded Grimes. Not because Homer is better, but because Homer is Homer. And the show has decided that Homer's life works out. This is the thing that Grimes cannot endure. Not the unfairness abstractly, the specific, concrete, irrefutable fact of it. That the rules that have governed his own life, the rules that say effort produces reward, and competence produces security, and diligence produces standing, do not apply uniformly. That Homer exists in a pocket of exemption from these rules. That the pocket is invisible from the outside but absolutely real. Grimes grabs the live wires at the end of the episode as a satirical gesture. He is performing Homer's immunity, demonstrating it, holding it up to the light. He is saying, "Watch. If Homer did this, he would be fine. So I will do it too. Watch me be fine." But Frank Grimes is not Homer. He is not protected. He is not exempt. He is a real person in a cartoon world. And real people cannot survive what Homer survives. He dies. The electrical current kills him. At the funeral, Homer falls asleep. He mumbles something from his dream state that is, in the abstract technical sense, funny. The congregation laughs, including Bart and Lenny and Carl, people who presumably knew Grimes at least slightly, who worked alongside him, who watched his breakdown. They laugh. The funeral ends in laughter. And Frank Grimes, who was the most qualified person in the building he worked in, who was right about everything he said, who was not wrong about a single specific thing, is in the ground. The episode does not undercut this. It does not walk it back. Homer does not have a moment of recognition. There is no redemption. There is just the laughter and the credits and the show moving on. The controversy has two components. The first is whether the episode was the right thing for the show to do to itself. The second is what the episode is actually saying about the world. On the first question, the fans who found the episode upsetting were responding to something real. The episode took the show's most beloved character and subjected him to a sustained critique that made it very difficult to enjoy him the way you usually enjoy him. For 42 minutes, Homer is not the warm, bumbling, occasionally heroic figure the show usually presents. He is an argument. He is evidence of a system that does not reward effort or competence. He is the problem. And sitting with him as the problem, rather than as the beloved cartoon man you have been watching for years, is uncomfortable. The fans who found the episode liberating were responding to something equally real. The show was willing to examine its own premise honestly. To bring in a character whose function was to say the thing that the audience might have thought but never quite articulated, that by any real-world logic, Homer's life makes no sense. That the immunity the show grants him is not neutral. That the world of Springfield is built on a kind of fundamental exception from the consequences that govern actual human lives. Both responses are valid. They are responses to different things the episode is doing simultaneously. On the second question, the question of what the episode says about the actual world, this is where the episode has aged in ways that its original makers probably could not have anticipated. Frank Grimes was, in 1997, a recognizable comic type, the aggrieved meritocrat, the person who has done everything the culture told them to do and has not received the promised rewards. His rage was legible in 1997 as a specific, containable kind of comedy. The episode could make him sympathetic and then have him die, and the death could function as a dark comedic grace note, the punchline of the thought experiment. In the decades since, the experience of Frank Grimes has become far more widespread. The gap between the effort the culture rewards and the outcomes it produces, the gap between what hard work is supposed to guarantee and what it actually delivers, has become one of the defining anxieties of working life in America and beyond. The specific displacement Grimes feels, the discovery that the rules are not operating the way he was told they operate, is not a comic premise anymore. It is a description of a real experience that very many real people have had. The episode did not predict this, but it mapped it. It took a real social mechanism, the gap between meritocratic promise and meritocratic reality, and gave it a character and a story. And the character and the story have become more resonant with each year that passes. This is one of the things that the best Simpsons does. It takes something that is true about the world and makes it specific enough and comic enough and human enough that you can hold it and examine it. And then years pass and the truth becomes more visible, and you go back to the episode and you find that it was always about something bigger than you initially understood. Homer's enemy was always about something bigger than a cartoon character having a bad week. It was about what happens to a person who genuinely believed in a system and then discovered that the system's promises were conditional in ways nobody had told him. It was about the specific madness that comes from being right, about the unfairness and having no recourse. It was about the gap between what a life of genuine effort should produce and what it actually produces when the rules are not what you thought they were. Frank Grimes is still in the ground in Springfield. Homer is still at the plant. The system is still the system. Number. Section 4. Saddle-sore Galactica. The year absurdism became arbitrary. Season 11, Episode 13. Saddle-sore Galactica. Aired the 6th of February 2000. Let me be honest about something before we go into this episode. Saddle-sore Galactica is not the worst episode of The Simpsons. It is not even in the bottom tier by any reasonable technical measure. It is a competently assembled piece of television that makes a specific creative choice, the mutant jockey underground, and commits to it with a kind of cheerful totality. The reason it appears on controversial episode lists, the reason it was for years cited as evidence of the show's creative decline, is not that it fails by conventional television standards. It is that it fails by Simpsons standards. And Simpsons standards, established across a decade of genuinely extraordinary work, are not the same as conventional television standards. Here is the episode in full detail. The Simpson family goes to a state fair. Homer is moved by the spectacle of a horse diving from a platform into a tank of water, an act that he finds degrading to the horse. He rescues the horse. Bart names him Duncan. Homer decides Duncan will be a racehorse. Duncan trains. Duncan races. Duncan begins winning. The family's financial situation briefly improves. This is the episode's first act, and it is broadly fine. The comedy of Homer in the world of horse racing, his confident incompetence navigating a domain he knows nothing about and succeeding anyway through a combination of luck and the show's fundamental protection of its protagonist, is a familiar Simpsons mode executed with reasonable competence. And then the jockeys arrive. It is revealed, in a scene that the episode presents without apparent irony, that professional horse racing is secretly governed by a society of mutant jockeys who live in tunnels beneath the racetracks. They are grotesque creatures, small and malformed, possessing a kind of underground civilization organized around the maintenance of their control over horse racing outcomes. When a horse starts winning too many races, threatening the order they maintain, these jockeys emerge at night to threaten the horse's owners. They appear in Homer's basement. They are very clear about the consequences of Duncan continuing to win. And the episode then proceeds to use this as a genuine plot element. Homer navigates Duncan's racing career while managing threats from a subterranean community of mutant racing professionals. The jockeys are not a brief detour. They are the episode's third-act conflict. The fan community's primary question was, what is this in service of? Because surrealism had always been part of the show's vocabulary. The Simpsons had gone to genuinely strange places throughout its run and had done so brilliantly. But the brilliance of the earlier surrealism was always in its relationship to the rest of the episode. The strangeness was attached to something real. When Homer's soul was auctioned off, the absurdity of a literal soul being sold was grounded in Homer's very real need for donuts and his very real unwillingness to think about consequences. The supernatural premise was a distortion of Homer's actual character in an actual situation. The mutant jockeys are not attached to anything. They arrive without precedent. They are not a distortion of anything previously established in the episode. They are not revealing something about a character or a relationship or a theme that the episode has been developing. They are just there, because someone thought of them. Because the image of subterranean mutant jockeys threatening Homer Simpson in his basement is intrinsically ridiculous, and the episode found this sufficient. This is the distinction that matters. Intrinsically ridiculous is not the same as narratively purposeful. A thing can be funny as a concept and still be the wrong choice for a story if the story has nothing to connect it to. The mutant jockeys are, in the abstract, an amusing idea. In this episode, in this plot, at this moment in the story, they are a choice made because no one quite figured out what the episode was actually about. The comic book guy sequence deserves its own extended examination because it is one of the most commented on moments in late-era Simpsons history, and what it means is more complicated than it is usually given credit for. In the middle of the episode, comic book guy appears at a horse race and complains about a previous episode of a show he watches, having already done the premise of a horse who is also a musician. The joke is structured as a complaint about a different show, but the implication, which the writing staff clearly understood would register, was that comic book guy was complaining about this episode, about The Simpsons doing something that felt like a lesser version of something it had done better before. The episode acknowledged the criticism, and then it continued unchanged. The mutant jockeys arrived on schedule. The absurdism proceeded. The episode made no adjustment whatsoever in response to the critique it had just embedded in itself. For fans, this read as a specific kind of arrogance. Acknowledging a criticism without addressing it is not the same as responding to it. In fact, it can be worse than not acknowledging it at all. If you name the problem and then proceed as if you had not named it, you are not demonstrating self-awareness. You are demonstrating that self-awareness is insufficient motivation to change course. You are saying, "We see the problem. We have decided not to fix it. Here is the rest of the episode." The reaction to this was not amused. It was genuine frustration from fans who felt the show was treating their intelligence as something to be acknowledged and then overridden. The comic book guy moment was not an invitation to engage with the criticism. It was a preemptive dismissal of it. Here is the critique. We have registered it. Now watch the mutant jockeys. But I want to do something slightly unfair to the consensus view and argue that there is more to this episode than the mutant jockeys, and that the more is worth finding. The episode has a B-plot about Lisa. She is competing in a school band competition at the state fair. Her band plays beautifully. They lose to another group that, as Lisa discovers, cheated. The opposing band used electronic instruments hidden inside acoustic shells, producing a technically superior sound that had nothing to do with the children's actual musical ability. Lisa discovers this. She gathers evidence. She brings the evidence to the competition authorities. The authorities acknowledge that the evidence is real. They tell her the cheating occurred. They tell her that the trophy will not be returned. The decision stands. Lisa is thanked for bringing the matter to their attention and shown the door. This is not played broadly. It does not have a comedic resolution. Lisa simply encounters, for the first of many times across the show's history, the specific bureaucratic reality that institutions exist to maintain their own decisions rather than to guarantee fairness. The people running the competition are not corrupt in any dramatic sense. They are simply indifferent. The cheating happened, the trophy was awarded, the paperwork is done, and reopening the matter would require effort and generate controversy and produce outcomes that are unpredictable. It is easier to thank Lisa for her concern and let the decision stand. Lisa walks away carrying the evidence of an injustice that no one with power to address it wants to address. The episode does not give her a dramatic speech. It does not give her a confrontation that changes anything. It gives her the experience, very common and very specific, of being right in a context where being right is insufficient. This is not a throwaway subplot. This is careful, honest storytelling about a real thing that happens to real people. And because the episode is primarily discussed in terms of mutant jockeys, this subplot almost never comes up, which is a shame. It is evidence that even in the episodes where the main story was miscalibrated, the show's capacity for genuine observation was still functioning somewhere. Number, Section 5. That 90s South show, The Rewrite That Burned the Foundation. Season 19, Episode 11. That 90s show aired the 27th of January 2008. By season 19, the conversation about the show's decline was not a conversation anymore. It was an established fact of the fan community's self-understanding. The show was in decline, had been in decline for a decade, would probably continue to decline indefinitely. These were the terms people watched on, and within those terms, individual episodes were evaluated not against the standard of the golden years, but against the lower standard of a show that was no longer trying to be what it had been. Then that 90s show arrived and reset the terms of the argument. Because what it did was not simply produce a bad episode. Bad episodes had been happening for years and had been absorbed. What it did was commit the most egregious continuity violation in the show's history. And it did so in a way that was impossible to dismiss as incidental or accidental. It was deliberate. It was the entire point of the episode. The context you need. The Simpsons had established, across years of flashback episodes and backstory revelations in the early 1990s, that Homer and Marge were teenagers in the late 1970s. Their courtship was rooted in a specific cultural moment. The music, the fashion, the events they referenced when talking about their past all anchored them in a particular era. These flashback episodes were not afterthoughts. They were beloved and detailed and emotionally rich. The late 1970s Homer, awkward and desperate and genuinely in love. The late 1970s Marge, navigating the specific constraints of what was available to her. These were characters the audience knew. That 90s show told the audience they had been remembering wrong. The episode depicted Homer and Marge as young adults in the 1990s. Homer is in a grunge band. He has the flannel. He has the unwashed hair. The cultural references are all specifically, deliberately 1990s. Marge goes to college. She nearly falls for a pompous intellectual in a specific early 1990s way. The episode is not vague about what it is doing. It is loudly, completely, unapologetically revising the era of Homer and Marge's courtship from the 1970s to the 1990s. The fan community's reaction was the most intense the show had generated since The Principal and the Pauper 11 years earlier. The arguments were everywhere, on fan sites and message boards and comment sections. The consensus was clear. This was the most destructive continuity violation in the show's history. Worse than the Tamzarian revelation because, where that had destroyed one character's backstory, this had destroyed the foundational backstory of the show's central relationship. I want to try to understand the decision before I argue about whether it was right. The floating timeline is the technical explanation. Homer and Marge are middle-aged in 2008. If they were teenagers in the late 1970s, they would be in their late 40s or early 50s by 2008. The show had been using a floating timeline, keeping the characters at constant ages while the world's present moved forward. And by 2008, the gap had grown too large to quietly maintain. The original backstory was becoming mathematically impossible. Something had to give. The question was what? The writers could have chosen to simply let the period references fade, to make the flashback era vague enough to accommodate a sliding timeline without explicitly setting it in any new decade. This would have been the less disruptive choice. Fans would have noticed the vagueness, would have understood what it meant, would have quietly accepted the mathematical necessity without being asked to actively replace something they valued. Instead, the writers went the other direction. They made an entire episode explicitly set in the 1990s with all the period detail cranked up to maximum. They did not quietly revise the backstory. They loudly replaced it. The replacement was not invisible. It required the audience to actively unknow something they had known for 15 years. To go back through their mental model of Homer and Marge's history and erase the late 1970s version and insert a 1990s version in its place. To retroactively reframe every flashback episode they had ever seen and re-understand it as depicting something different from what they had understood it to depict. This is not a small ask, and the episode does not quite earn it. The emotional story the episode is trying to tell, Homer and Marge nearly losing each other before they have fully found each other, is a real story. It cares about these characters. The specific way it handles their near separation, the misunderstanding that drives them apart, and the understanding that brings them back, has the bones of something the show has always done well. Homer's love for Marge as the thing that survives everything else. The marriage as the center of gravity that all the chaos orbits around. But you cannot tell that story, or not fully, when you are simultaneously asking the audience to process the destruction of everything they previously believed about when and how the story happened. The emotional content of the episode around the two things interfere with each other, and the emotional content, which needs the audience to be fully present and fully open, loses the fight. This is the specific tragedy of that 90s sash show. The story it was trying to tell was worth telling. The method it chose to tell, it made the telling impossible. Number. Section 6. Lisa Goes Gaga. The Problem with Pure Sincerity. Season 23, Episode 22. Lisa Goes Gaga. Aired the 20th of May, 2012. There is a specific kind of television controversy that arises when critical institutions and fan communities evaluate the same piece of work by entirely different criteria and reach entirely opposite conclusions. Lisa Goes Gaga is one of the most extreme examples of this dynamic in the show's history. It won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. It received some of the lowest fan ratings of any episode in the series. These two facts can coexist because the Emmy and the fan rating are measuring different things. The Emmy voters were evaluating technical achievement, production ambition, message, execution of stated goals, and the success of the celebrity collaboration. On those criteria, the episode is a genuine achievement. The animation that accompanied Lady Gaga's sequences is elaborate and impressive. The collaboration required significant production effort. The message, that people who feel invisible deserve to be seen, is one the Television Academy found worthy. The fan community was evaluating something else. They were evaluating faithfulness. Whether the episode honored the specific emotional and character logic that 23 seasons had established, whether it felt like a Simpsons episode in the deepest sense of that term, and by that measure, the episode failed. The specific failure is structural more than it is about any particular scene or joke. The Simpsons, at its best, maintained a very specific relationship with sincerity. The show was not averse to sincerity. It was capable of genuine emotional depth, capable of making you feel things strongly, capable of the kind of storytelling that stays with you. But the sincerity always arrived in a particular way. It was earned through comedy. Through the accumulation of jokes and absurdity and irreverence, through all the work the comedy was doing, until the moment was ready for the sincerity to land. The comedy built the architecture. The sincerity was the thing the architecture supported. Lisa Goes Gaga is sincerity without the architecture. The comedy in the episode is gentle and warm and nice, but it is decorative rather than structural. It does not build toward anything. It does not create the conditions in which the emotional content can land with the weight the episode intends. The episode is attempting to move you, and it is doing so without the machinery that the show's most moving episodes were always using underneath their most amusing surfaces. The result is an episode that feels pleasant and somewhat inert. The sincerity is visible, but it cannot reach full depth because there is nothing underneath it giving it purchase. There is also the question of what the episode says about Lisa. Across 23 seasons, Lisa's character had been built around a specific kind of self-sufficiency that is hard-won and fragile and always in the process of being defended and re-earned. The self-sufficiency is not in the emotional sense. Lisa is deeply emotionally dependent on connection and recognition. She needs to be seen. The loneliness of her situation in Springfield, genuinely intelligent and genuinely sensitive in a world that does not particularly value either, is one of the show's most consistently painful and most consistently honest threads. But Lisa's relationship with her own worth has always been generated from the inside. The Lisa who appears in the great episodes, the Lisa of Stark Raving Dad and Lisa on Ice, and Lisa the Vegetarian and Last Temptation of Homer, is a character who fights for her own identity and her own convictions. Not because anyone tells her she is right to fight for them, but because she has determined that she is right to fight for them. The determination is internally generated. This is part of what makes her extraordinary. The Lisa of Lisa Goes Gaga finds self-acceptance because a globally famous pop star noticed her and told her she was worthy. And this is presented without irony, as a good and sufficient resolution. It is not that Lady Gaga's validation is without value. It is that the mechanism by which Lisa achieves self-acceptance in this episode is not the mechanism the show spent 23 seasons establishing as Lisa's. Lisa does not wait to be noticed by the right person before she can believe in herself. Or rather, the Lisa the show had been building does not. The Lisa of this episode is different. Smaller, more dependent, a character who needed someone to discover her rather than someone who discovers herself. This is a diminishment dressed up as a tribute, and the fan community, which had been watching Lisa for 23 seasons, recognized the diminishment even if the Emmy voters did not. Number Section 7. The Boys of Bummer, the episode that got something real wrong. Season 18, Episode 18, The Boys of Bummer, aired the 6th of May 2007. There are episodes on our list that are controversial because of what they did to the show's mythology. There are episodes that are controversial because of what they did to specific characters. And then there is The Boys of Bummer, which is controversial because of something more basic and more uncomfortable, what it does to you while you are watching it. Let me tell you precisely what happens. Bart, playing for the Springfield children's baseball team, has the chance to make the catch that wins the championship. He drops the ball. Springfield loses. The entire town of Springfield then spends the episode subjecting Bart to sustained, escalating public humiliation for this mistake. The humiliation is not a brief beat in a larger story. The humiliation is the episode. It builds and stacks. The town writes Bart Simpson drops flies and blows championship on the town water tower. People who have no particular investment in the baseball outcome chant at him in the street. He is mocked by strangers. He is degraded publicly in ways that multiply across the episode's runtime. At approximately the midpoint of the episode, Bart has been so thoroughly and systematically ground down that he climbs the water tower and stands at the top. The episode treats this as a gag. It is not, in any meaningful sense, a gag. The episode then continues. The humiliation continues. It does not relent until the third act, when the opposing team's player admits he dropped the ball first, and Bart is vindicated. At which point the town, which has been mercilessly cruel to a child for the episode's entire runtime, reverses instantly and celebrates him. The fan community's rejection of this episode was nearly universal and has remained consistent across the years since. And the rejection was not misplaced. The episode is genuinely wrong about something fundamental. The something it is wrong about is not its subject matter. Small communities do designate scapegoats. They do transfer collective anxiety onto single individuals. The specific mechanism, a town that turned a child's sporting mistake into a campaign of public shame, is a recognizable exaggeration of a real social behavior. The show has always been willing to depict things that are uncomfortable and real. The something it is wrong about is the handling. Satire requires a frame. It requires the audience to be positioned in a place where they can see that the show is critiquing the behavior being depicted rather than simply staging it. When the satirical frame is strong and clear, the audience can engage with darkness from a position of relative safety. They understand that they are watching an argument about something, a demonstration of what a certain kind of cruelty looks like and why it operates. The discomfort is purposeful. It serves the argument. The Boys of Bummer has a satirical frame. It just does not have a satirical frame strong enough to hold the weight of what it is putting on it. The comedy surrounding the cruelty does not create sufficient distance from the cruelty. The episode's tone is not quite dark comedy, not quite drama, not quite clear satire. It is in an uncomfortable middle zone where the cruelty to Bart is too vividly depicted to be purely comic and not contextualized enough to function as clear critique. You watch the town humiliate Bart, and you do not experience it as satire. You experience it as watching a child be humiliated. The frame is not visible enough. The argument is not strong enough. And what you are left with is 42 minutes of a child suffering without sufficient narrative justification for the suffering. Marge's speech near the end, in which she directly condemns the town's behavior, is the episode trying to supply the frame retroactively. It does not work. Retroactively supplied frames are almost never sufficient, because the experience of watching has already happened and the speech cannot change what was experienced. The episode is not without defenders. The defense is that the episode was depicting something real, that the show has always been willing to go to dark places, that the resolution, however delayed, does arrive. These points are not wrong, but they do not quite address the specific problem. The problem is not that dark subject matter was depicted. The problem is that the handling was not adequate to the darkness, that the execution did not match the ambition, that what the episode was trying to be and what it actually was were different enough to matter. Number. Section 8. Kill the alligator and run the chaos that forgot its purpose. Season 11, Episode 19, Kill the Alligator and Run, aired the 30th of April 2000. The TV Guide poll called this the worst episode of the series. Fan polls have largely agreed, and when you spend time with the episode, you can see why the consensus settled where it did. But you can also see something that the consensus sometimes misses, which is that the episode is not simply bad in a careless or lazy way. It is bad in a specific and instructive way, bad in a way that reveals something about what was happening to the show's creative process at this particular moment. The episode begins with a genuinely interesting premise. Homer takes a magazine quiz. The quiz tells him he will die in 3 years. This strikes Homer, who has an extremely specific and deeply felt anxiety about his own mortality, as credible information. He cannot shake it. He begins to deteriorate under the weight of the knowledge. This is rich. Homer's relationship with his own mortality is one of the show's most consistently interesting and least often fully explored threads. He knows at some level below the comedy that the life he has lived has not been all it could have been, that his children are partially paying the cost of his limitations, that the time available to him is finite, and that he has not spent it as well as he might have. These are things Homer carries. The show has touched them before. An episode that built seriously from Homer's mortality anxiety, that put him through the experience of genuinely confronting his own finitude and what it meant, could have been one of the best things season 11 produced. The episode does not build from there. Homer's mortality anxiety is used as a mechanism to get the family to Florida for spring break, where Homer proceeds to cause chaos of escalating absurdity that includes accidentally killing a beloved local alligator named Captain Albert, being sentenced to labor on a chain gang, escaping the chain gang, being chased across the state, and encountering Kid Rock and Joe C. in a subplot that does not connect to the main narrative in any way that matters. The mortality anxiety disappears. The premise is abandoned. What replaces it is spectacle without emotional grounding. Things happen. Characters run. Things get destroyed. The chain gang is involved. The alligator is dead. And none of it is in conversation with the thing the episode started from, which was Homer's genuine and recognizable fear of dying before he has done something worth dying for. This is the specific failure mode that becomes more common in the later seasons. The show discovering a premise with genuine emotional potential and then departing from that premise in favor of escalating plot spectacle. The premise is strong enough to be interesting as a setup. The execution then provides a completely different episode from the one the setup promised. What you are left with is the gap, the promise and the delivery, sitting next to each other, defining each other by contrast. You can see what the episode could have been. You can see what it became. And the distance between those two things is the measure of the disappointment. The Kid Rock and Joe C. subplot is the element most reliably identified as the show completely losing the thread, and the identification is accurate. There is a mode of celebrity guest appearance that serves the story, and a mode that simply places the celebrity in proximity to the story. The first mode requires the celebrity to interact with the episode's world in a way that illuminates something about that world, about the characters, about the theme. The second mode requires only that the celebrity be present and recognizable. Kill the Alligator and Run is using the second mode. Kid Rock and Joe C. are there. They perform. They interact briefly with Bart, and then the episode continues as if they were not there, because narratively speaking, they were not there. Their presence changes nothing. Their absence would change nothing. They are guest stars deployed as decoration rather than as elements of a story. In the golden years, the guest star almost always had a specific narrative function. James Brown added something irreplaceable to his appearance. Dustin Hoffman's Mr. Bergstrom, who was never even credited under Hoffman's real name, was one of the most fully realized characters in the show's history. Even the simpler celebrity appearances in the peak years tended to serve the episode's comic logic in specific ways. By season 11, the celebrity appearance had sometimes become its own justification. The show was putting famous people in episodes because famous people in episodes was a thing the show did, not because this particular famous person had something irreplaceable to contribute to this particular story. The result was episodes that were energetic without being meaningful, busy without being purposeful. And Kill the Alligator and Run is the exemplar of this mode. It is always moving. Things are always happening, and the movement is going nowhere. Section 9. The Secondary Controversies. Episodes that deserve their own reckoning. There are episodes that generate fierce, sustained, documented controversy of the kind we have been examining. And then there are episodes that produce a different kind of controversy, quieter, more diffuse, but in some ways more revealing. Controversies not of fury, but of confusion, of fans looking at something the show did and asking, in genuine bafflement, what was this supposed to be? Season 13, Episode 22. Papa's Got a Brand New Badge. Aired the 22nd of May 2002. This season finale finds Homer becoming Springfield's new security chief after the town disbands its police force following a heatwave riot. Homer's security company, Spring Shield, becomes popular and effective. Springfield prospers under his watch. And then Fat Tony and the mob show up and Homer has to face them down alone in a sequence that is specifically referencing high noon. The controversy is not that any individual element is wrong. The mob subplot is a reasonable story device. Homer facing a threat alone, relying on his own dubious resources, is a classic Simpsons structure. The high noon reference is competently executed. The controversy is that the episode is aggressively, comprehensively inconsequential. By its end, nothing that happened during it will matter in the next episode. The police force will be back. Springfield will be gone. Homer will be at the power plant. The specific creative choice of making a season finale, the episode that should carry the most weight of any in the season, feel as light and unmemorable as possible is bewildering in retrospect. This is not the creative boldness of a show willing to experiment. This is the specific fatigue of a show that has stopped thinking very hard about what it is doing with the premium real estate in its schedule. A season finale that could be any episode of any season, that carries no weight and leaves no residue, is not a creative decision. It is the absence of one. Season 17, Episode 8, The Italian Bob, aired the 11th of December 2005. This episode brings back Sideshow Bob after a long absence. He is living in Italy, in a small village, happily reformed, married with a child. He has renounced his criminal past. He is genuinely at peace. The controversy is about what the episode does to this. The Simpson family accidentally exposes his past to the village, destroying his new life. And then, inevitably, Sideshow Bob returns to attempting to kill Bart. The character arc that the episode briefly sketches, genuine reform, a second life built from something better than what came before, is dismantled for the sake of the show's established premise. Bob's return to villainy makes a kind of franchise logic. His character exists to threaten Bart. This is the engine that drives every Sideshow Bob episode. Dismantling the engine would end the franchise. But the episode, in the process of returning to the engine, does something that feels like a small cruelty. It shows you a version of Bob who has become something other than what the engine requires, and then it takes that version away to restore the engine. The audience watches something worth having be destroyed for franchise maintenance. In the golden years, Bob's pursuit of Bart always carried within it some acknowledgement of the tragedy of Bob's situation. A genuinely brilliant and capable man, a Yale-educated polymath, caught in a psychosis of obsession that the show never denied was a psychosis. His villainy was always complicated by his intelligence and his capacity for genuine feeling. The Italian Bob approaches the possibility of transcending the villainy and then retreats from it. And the retreat does not feel earned. It feels like the show blinking. Season 20, Episode 7, My Pods and Boomsticks, aired the 30th of November 2008. This episode's controversy is of a specifically political variety, and it is worth addressing directly. The episode features a Muslim family whose son befriends Bart. The father is initially presented as threatening and suspicious, and Homer's escalating paranoia about the family drives the episode's central conflict. The family is revealed to be perfectly ordinary, and the episode's third act explicitly addresses the unfairness of the suspicion that has been directed at them. Fans were divided about whether the episode handled its subject with sufficient care. The defense. The episode is specifically criticizing the kind of post-September 11 Islamophobia that had become embedded in American culture, and it does so by making Homer the object of criticism rather than the Muslim family. The critique is directed at the paranoia, not at its target. The criticism? The episode nevertheless spends significant runtime on Homer's paranoid suspicion in ways that require the audience to sit with the stereotyping before the correction arrives. The Muslim father is coded as threatening through much of the episode's first two acts, and the correction of that coding in the third act does not fully undo what the first two acts established. Both positions are reasonable. The episode is genuinely trying to do something critical and socially aware. The question of whether it executes that intention successfully is a real question. What is clear is that by season 20, the show's capacity to handle genuinely sensitive subject matter with the precision that the golden era brought to questions of race, religion, and social difference had been significantly reduced. The bluntness of the episode's handling of its subject is partly an artifact of the show's general decline in precision. The intention was good. The execution was less careful than the intention required. Number. Section 10. Flanderization and what it actually means. We have been talking about specific episodes throughout this conversation. Let us step back and talk about a process. The process that the internet came to call flanderization, named after Ned Flanders, and what it actually describes when you look at it carefully. Flanderization, as the internet uses the term, describes the process by which a complex character is gradually reduced to a single defining trait. The character begins with multiple dimensions, with an inner life and contradictions and layers. Over time, one trait becomes more dominant. The other traits fade. The character becomes a simplified version of themselves, defined by a single quality that expands to fill all the space that their complexity previously occupied. Ned Flanders was not the first character to undergo this process in The Simpsons, but his name became attached to the concept because the process was particularly visible in his case, particularly well documented by fans, and particularly sad given what had been lost. The early Ned is a genuinely complex figure. He is kind. He is generous. He is devoutly religious. He is also, underneath all of this, carrying something that the show had slowly revealed over years, a genuine psychological history that complicated the apparent simplicity of his niceness. The episode that made this explicit is Season 8's Hurricane Neddy, in which Ned's house is destroyed by a hurricane and the town rebuilds it so badly it immediately collapses, and Ned has a complete breakdown. He screams at everyone who has ever wronged him. He says things he has been holding inside for decades, and then he is institutionalized, and in the psychiatric facility, it is revealed that Ned's relentless niceness is not natural. It is the product of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, being beatniks who did not believe in discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him. Ned's kindness is not a character trait. It is a psychological structure built around a person who, underneath it, is something different. This revelation recontextualized everything about Ned. His patience with Homer is not saintly. It is pathological, the response of someone who cannot express anger because his brain was rewired against it. His faith is not simple conviction. It is a coping mechanism, an external framework for a man who needs something to explain why he keeps suffering despite doing everything right. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is not grace. It is the programmed response of a man who was literally conditioned as a child to never allow himself to feel the rage that lives inside him. After Hurricane Neddy, you understood Ned differently. You saw the cost of the niceness. You saw what it was built on top of. And that understanding made him more interesting, more human, more specific. The most interesting version of Ned is the one who is fighting every day to be the person his conditioning made him, and who occasionally loses that fight, whose conditioning occasionally slips, and who in those moments reveals the person underneath. The late-era Ned has mostly lost this complexity. He became a one-note religious figure, a walking joke about evangelical Christianity, a character defined entirely by his faith and his niceness and his endless patience with Homer. The specific history of Hurricane Neddy, the psychological depth it added, faded into the background. The character became simpler, more caricatured, less human. This happened to Homer too, and to Marge, and to Bart. The characters in the show's later years are, with notable exceptions, simpler versions of the characters in the show's earlier years. Not because the writing became lazy, though sometimes it did, but because the writing had used up the easy complexity and needed more effort to find new complexity in characters that had been explored for a long time. Finding new complexity in familiar characters is one of the hardest things long-form storytelling requires. It needs writers who know these people deeply and who are willing to look in unexpected places for the new dimensions. When that effort is not made, when the writers default to the traits that are most established and most recognizable, the characters simplify. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but incrementally, across seasons. And the incremental simplification is its own kind of loss. Not the acute, specific loss of the principal and the pauper. A slower loss. The gradual reduction of the familiar into something that resembles the familiar, but no longer carries all of what made the familiar moving. Let me spend some time with Homer specifically, because Homer's trajectory across the show's seasons is the most widely discussed and the most significant for the show's overall quality. The Golden Era Homer is a man defined by a specific and recognizable tension. He is selfish, impulsive, frequently oblivious, capable of genuine harm to the people around him. He is also, underneath all of this, capable of moments of genuine and complete love. The love is not performative. It is not tactical. It is the deepest thing in him, the thing that breaks through his selfishness at the moments when it matters most. What made this Homer extraordinary to watch was the tension between the two modes. His selfishness was real. His love was real. And the show did not resolve the tension by making the love always win, or by making the selfishness always win. It let them coexist. It let Homer be both things simultaneously, which is what real people are. The capacity for genuine love does not cancel the capacity for genuine selfishness. They both live in the same person. The relationship between them is complicated and ongoing and never finally resolved. The late-era Homer simplified this tension in two directions depending on the episode. Sometimes he was simplified toward the pure selfishness, an unanchored ID who caused damage without the counterbalancing love being adequately present. Other times he was simplified toward an exaggerated sentimentality, a Homer who expressed his love for his family in terms that were too emphatic, too direct, too obvious to carry the emotional weight that the early show's more oblique and more precise handling had carried. Both simplifications missed the thing that made the golden era Homer work. The thing that made him work was not his selfishness and not his love separately, but the specific way they coexisted in the same person at the same time. The way you could watch him do something genuinely awful and then, in the same episode, see the love surface in a moment of complete and unguarded tenderness, and understand that both were true simultaneously. That is a hard thing to write. It requires patience and precision and a refusal to simplify in either direction. And it is the specific thing that is hardest to maintain across hundreds of episodes and dozens of writers over many years. Number. Section 11. The geography of decline mapping the good years and the difficult ones. We have been talking about the decline as if it were a single event, a cliff that the show walked off at a specific moment. But the reality is more complicated and more interesting than that. The decline was a landscape. It had hills in it. Episodes that rose back toward the quality of the golden years, even in seasons that were generally considered compromised. Writers who found something brilliant even in periods when the show's overall direction was uncertain. Let us map some of that landscape. Season 12 is usually considered one of the early decline seasons, and it is true that it contains episodes that are significantly weaker than anything in seasons 3 through 8. Homer versus Dignity is here. Several other episodes that do not quite find their footing. The season's overall hit rate is lower than the golden era's. But season 12 also contains Skinner's Sense of Snow, an episode set in a blizzard that traps the Springfield elementary children with an increasingly unhinged Skinner, and it is pure, joyful, beautifully constructed Simpsons comedy. Every element is working. The escalation of Skinner's increasingly baroque responses to the situation, the children's responses to the escalation, the increasingly impractical solutions, the timing of every comedic beat. This is the show working at something very close to its best, and it is in Season 12. Season 14 is broadly considered a weak season, and Season 14 contains 3 Gays of the Condo, an episode about Homer discovering that Marge, early in their marriage, had written a love letter to another man. The episode handles the emotional complexity of this discovery with real care. Homer's genuine devastation, not as comedy but as a real thing, a real hurt. The question of what it means to discover that your marriage, the thing you have built your life on, was once a less certain thing than you thought. The resolution, which honors the marriage without pretending the revelation did not happen, is earned. Season 15 contains The Way We Weren't, a flashback episode about how Homer and Marge met at summer camp when they were young children, told with a warmth and a specificity that feels continuous with the best flashback episodes of the golden years. It is not quite as good as the finest early flashbacks, but it is genuinely good. It cares about these people, and it shows that caring in the specific details it chooses. The point is that the decline was not a total blackout. It was a dimming, with pockets of full brightness that persisted even in the dimmer years. And those pockets matter. They are evidence that the show's best impulses, its genuine care for its characters, its capacity for emotional honesty, its ability to find something true and render it with precision and warmth, did not simply evaporate. They became less consistent, less reliable, less the defining mode of the show and more the occasional exception. But they were there. Season 22 brought us The Bob Next Door, a Sideshow Bob episode that did something genuinely creative with the franchise's established parameters. It found a new angle on a character who had been in the show for decades, and used that new angle to generate both comedy and a kind of plot tension that the Bob episodes had not managed for years. It is not a classic episode, but it is an episode that tried something, and the trying is visible and respectable. Season 25 brought us You Don't Have to Live Like a Referee, in which Homer is invited to referee at the World Cup, and the episode sends him to Brazil for a storyline that is simultaneously a fish-out-of-water comedy and a story about integrity under pressure. The episode's handling of bribery in international sports is not sophisticated, but its handling of Homer's relationship with his own principles, the discovery that there is something he will not compromise, even when the pressure to compromise is significant, reaches for something true. Season 27 brought us Puffless, which focused on Patty and Selma and their relationship with smoking, and which managed to make Marge's sisters feel like real people for perhaps the first time in many years. The episode remembered that Patty and Selma have inner lives, that they chose the lives they have for reasons that are understandable, and that the surface of their personalities conceals complexity that is worth finding. These episodes are not the show at its absolute peak, but they are the show being itself at varying levels of effectiveness, with genuine commitment to the things the show has always cared about. And their existence across the so-called decline years complicates the narrative of total creative failure. The show did not fall. It became less reliable, less consistent, less certain. But it did not become empty. The emptiness that the most negative accounts of the post-golden years suggest would have required the loss of something more fundamental than consistency. And the fundamental thing, the genuine care for these characters and this world and what it means to tell their story, was never entirely lost. Number, Section 12. What 36 years of controversy actually teaches us. We have been in Springfield for a very long time tonight. We have moved through the episodes that divided audiences, the arguments that have never quite settled, the specific textures of each controversy, and what they reveal about the show, and about the people who loved it deeply enough to feel hurt by it. I want to spend this final section asking what all of it means, not adjudicating the controversies, not arriving at final verdicts, but asking what it means that a cartoon television show has generated this much sustained, passionate argument across this many decades. The first thing it means is that the promise was real. You cannot feel betrayed by something you never believed in. The intensity of the fan reaction to The Principal and the Pauper, to That 90s Show, to Lisa Goes Gaga, to The Boys of Bummer, to all the episodes we have spent this night examining, is precisely proportionate to the intensity of what the show built in its golden years. The fans who were most furious were the fans who had invested most deeply. And they had invested most deeply because the show had given them something genuinely worth investing in. The Simpsons in its peak years was extraordinary. Not merely very good television, not merely the best animated series on the air, genuinely extraordinary by the highest standards of what storytelling can accomplish. Episodes like Mother Simpson and Homer the Heretic and Last Exit to Springfield and You Only Move Twice are not just excellent comedy. They are excellent explorations of real human experience, rendered through cartoon characters with a specificity and an emotional precision that most drama, live action or otherwise, does not manage. An audience that experienced that excellence and then kept watching as the consistency declined is not an audience that failed to understand what they were watching. It is an audience that understood exactly what they were watching and was unwilling to stop hoping for it to return. The controversies are not evidence of unreasonable expectations. They are evidence of reasonable expectations generated by the show itself during the years when it was consistently meeting them. The second thing the pattern of controversy teaches us is something about how we build relationships with long-running stories, and what those relationships require. The Simpsons was always going to run into the problem of its own duration. Any creative project that extends across multiple decades will eventually exhaust the territory it started from. The characters will have been explored. The relationships will have been examined. The world will have been depicted from every angle. And the question of what comes after that exhaustion, how you continue to tell stories about people whose inner lives you have already mapped comprehensively, is one of the hardest questions in long-form storytelling. The show's response to this challenge was inconsistent. Sometimes it found genuinely new territory, discovered new aspects of familiar characters, found new angles on the show's central relationships. Sometimes it repeated itself in ways that were adequate but not inspired. And sometimes, in the episodes that produced the most acute controversy, it chose to revise what it had established rather than extend it, to replace rather than to build upon. The replacements are the things fans have never forgiven. Not the repetitions, not the misfires. The replacements. Because the repetitions and the misfires preserve the foundation. They do not honor the foundation perfectly, but they acknowledge it. They operate within it. They assume that what was built is real and worth working with. The replacements say something different. They say the foundation was provisional, subject to revision, less solid than you thought. And this is the message that the people who built their love for the show on the foundation cannot receive without grief. There is something else worth saying before we close tonight. Something that does not always get said in these conversations because the controversy is so powerful that it crowds out other things. The show has also, across all those seasons, given an extraordinary amount of joy. An extraordinary number of nights like this one, sitting with Springfield, letting it be familiar, letting the voices be familiar, letting the world be the world it has always been. The episodes that worked. The jokes that still work 30 years later. The moments that made you feel seen in the specific way that the best comedy makes you feel seen. The sense that here is a piece of art that understands something about being a person that you also understand and did not know how to articulate until the show showed you how. The golden years gave us moments of comedy that are as perfectly constructed as anything in the history of the form. The scene in Last Exit to Springfield, where Homer is trying to negotiate union terms with Burns, while also trying to follow the plot of a spy movie he is watching on TV simultaneously. The sequence in Cape Fear where Sideshow Bob walks through an entire field of rakes and keeps hitting himself in the face. The moment in You Only Move Twice, when Hank Scorpio stops an international hostage crisis to run back and personally give Homer the loafer he asked about. These are moments of pure comedic genius. Structurally perfect, timed with absolute precision, delivering exactly the right amount of information in exactly the right order to produce exactly the right response. This is craft at its absolute highest level, and the show produced it consistently across years. And the emotional moments. Homer asking Lisa if he will like her music in the future, at the end of And Maggie Makes Three, and Lisa playing something on her saxophone and Homer closing his eyes and listening. The final shot of Mother Simpson. Homer sitting on the hood of his car in a parking lot, looking up at the night sky for a long time, not saying anything. These are moments that require something of you when you watch them. That insist on being felt. The controversies are real. The decline is real. The specific betrayals that specific episodes committed are real. And the joy is also real. The achievement is also real. The moments that changed how people understood themselves and their families and their communities are also real. All of these things coexist in 36 seasons. None of them cancels the others. The final thing I want to say is something about Springfield itself. Not the episodes, not the controversies. The town. Springfield is a place that exists nowhere and everywhere. It has mountains and ocean and desert within driving distance. Its residents are yellow and have 4 fingers and have been the same age for 36 years. Its nuclear power plant leaks. Its billionaire employer remembers the Spanish-American War. Its principal is an imposter. Its baseball team is in permanent competitive ambiguity. Its police force is technically operational. And in the middle of all of this, on Evergreen Terrace, there is a house. A yellow house with a green yard. And in the house, there is a family. A father who loves his family more completely than he can express it without breaking something. A mother who has built her entire strength from the inside out across decades of unremarkable heroism. A son who is smarter and more feeling than the institutions designed to measure him can recognize. A daughter who carries the weight of understanding more than the world around her wants to understand. And a baby who is watching everything from behind a pacifier, saying nothing, waiting. They are on the couch tonight. The television is on. Homer is half asleep. Marge went upstairs an hour ago. Bart and Lisa are in their rooms, separately, in the specific way that kids are alone in their rooms while still being part of a household. Maggie is in her crib. The house is holding them. Whatever you think about Season 12, whatever you felt about the principal and the pauper, whatever your position is on Saddlesore Galactica or That 90s Show or Lisa Goes Gaga, whatever the decades of controversy have done to your relationship with this show, the house is still standing, the family is still inside it, the television is still on. And that is the thing the show has always been about. Underneath the nuclear plant and the billionaire and the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the floating timeline and every decision the writers ever made that you agreed with or disagreed with. The house on Evergreen Terrace and the people in it and the specific quality of ordinary life that the show has always been trying to honor, even when it did not quite manage it, even when it made choices that seemed to contradict everything ordinary life requires. Homer comes home at the end of the episode. He always does. Through every controversy and every reset and every season of varying quality and every argument the fan community has ever had about whether the show still knows what it is, he comes through the door, the television is on, his family is in the house. That is still enough. We have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. Through the arguments and the quiet revisitations and the episodes that made people furious and the episodes that made people sad and the episodes that made people laugh so hard they had to pause and recover, through the golden years and the decline years and the complicated space between them where most of the show's actual history lives, I hope it was worth the time. I hope the familiar voices, even when they were arguing, made the night feel a little less empty, a little more like somewhere you have been before and can always find again when you need it. Springfield will be here when you wake up, the house will be standing, the family will be inside it, the television will be on. It always is. That is the whole point. Number. Bonus. Section 1. Season 9's Other Casualties. The episodes that got caught in the crossfire. The controversy around the principal and the pauper cast such a long shadow over Season 9 that several episodes from that season have never quite received the fair hearing they deserve. The wariness the audience carried after the Tamzarian revelation colored everything that followed it in the season, and some genuinely interesting television suffered for it. Let us try to correct that, at least partially. Season 9, Episode 4, Treehouse of Horror 8, aired the 26th of October 1997. The Treehouse of Horror specials exist outside the show's canonical reality and are therefore, structurally, the safest episodes the show makes. They are not subject to continuity arguments. They cannot betray character logic because they are explicitly departures from it. They exist in their own space, free to do anything, answerable only to the question of whether they are funny and interesting and scary in the ways that Halloween specials should be. Treehouse 8 is very good. Its 3 segments are distinct in tone and execution, but all demonstrate the show at something close to its peak in the pure craft of comedy. The segment in which Homer survives a neutron bomb because he was already at the bottom of a lake inside an airtight bag of fat, becoming the last man in Springfield and discovering that solitude initially suits him extremely well, is a beautiful piece of character comedy. The segment based on The Fly, in which Homer and Bart switch heads in a teleportation accident and must live with the consequences, finds exactly the right level of absurdity. And the segment in which the witches of Salem, the ancestors of the Simpsons family, practice magic in a way that is played simultaneously for horror and for comedy, has a visual inventiveness that Season 9 was still capable of when it wanted to be. But even this excellent episode, airing 4 weeks after The Principal and the Pauper, was watched by an audience that was already slightly guarded, that was waiting, somewhere in the back of the mind, for the next shoe to drop. The Treehouse specials got a pass, as they always did. But the pass was given in a context that had changed. Season 9, Episode 6, Bart Star, aired the 9th of November, 1997. We touched on this one earlier, but it deserves more sustained attention because the episode has a quality that gets overlooked in the conversation about its failures. Homer as an overinvested sports parent is a premise with genuine possibilities. The specific psychological dynamic, the parent whose ego investment in a child's performance reflects something about their own unresolved anxieties, is recognizable and real and comic. Homer having never been recognized or celebrated in his own athletic life, never having had the experience of winning, channels all of that unmet need into Bart's baseball career in a way that is both funny and, at certain moments, genuinely uncomfortable. The episode's best sequence is not the comedy of Homer's overinvestment, but the comedy of his eventual confrontation with the real stakes. When Bart tells him, directly and without drama, that Homer's coaching is not actually about the team or about Bart's development as a player, but about Homer's own need to feel important in some domain, the conversation has the quality of an argument in a real family. The directness of it, the specific hurt in Bart's articulation of the problem, the way Homer receives it, none of this is the easy comedy of a man who doesn't know any better. This is the harder comedy of a man who knows exactly what he has been doing and is confronted with the knowledge by the person it affects most. Homer's response to this confrontation, while not as fully developed as the confrontation deserves, reaches for something the episode had been building toward without quite knowing it. The handing over of the coaching role, the stepping back, the willingness to be smaller than he had been making himself, is not performed as a grand gesture. It is quiet. slightly embarrassed. The specific quality of a person doing the right thing without fanfare, because the fanfare would itself be another form of the wrong thing they were trying to stop doing. This moment is good. It is the show doing what the show was capable of in Season 9, even under the shadow of the controversy that had already arrived. Season 9, Episode 20, The Trouble with Trillions, aired the 5th of April, 1998. This is an episode about Homer becoming an FBI informant to avoid a tax evasion charge and eventually being sent to Cuba to recover a $1 trillion bill that Burns stole from the U.S. government during World War II. The premise is gloriously absurd, and the episode delivers on its absurdity with considerable skill. What makes this episode interesting in the context of our conversation about controversy is how little controversy it generated. It is completely insane, formally speaking. It requires accepting that the U.S. government printed a single $1 trillion bill, that Burns stole it during a wartime ceremony, that it ended up in Cuba, and that Homer's mission to recover it led to him personally delivering it to Fidel Castro. None of this is grounded in any kind of realistic logic, but the episode was accepted. Fans liked it. Critics appreciated it. The absurdism worked. The question is why, when Saddlesore Galactica's absurdism did not work in the same way for many fans, did this episode succeed? The answer is grounding. The Trouble with Trillions builds its absurdism from Homer's very real, very recognizable anxiety about his taxes. The opening sequence, Homer's procrastination, his dawning horror at the deadline, his panicked last-minute attempt to make the numbers work, is the kind of specifically observed domestic comedy that the early seasons did brilliantly. The absurdism that follows is an extension of Homer's situation, not a replacement of it. The $1 trillion bill and the Cuba plot are the consequence of Homer's tax anxiety, distorted through the show's particular lens until they become completely bizarre, but still connected by a clear narrative thread to something recognizable and true. The mutant jockeys are not the consequence of anything. They arrive independently. They are not attached to any character's genuine experience or situation. They are just there. And this distinction, grounded absurdism versus free-floating absurdism, is the line that separates the Simpsons surrealism that works from the Simpsons surrealism that does not. Number. Bonus Section 2. The Marge Question. What the show owed its strongest character. Marge Simpson is, by the measure of screen time and narrative centrality, not the show's main character. Homer is. The show is called The Simpsons, and the name of the patriarch is the one that appears most often in episode titles and that drives the most plots across the most seasons. Homer's journey is the engine, but Marge is the show's load-bearing character. She is the thing that holds the structure up, and what the show owes to a load-bearing character is different from what it owes to its protagonist. The protagonist gets to fail. The protagonist gets to be wrong and selfish and inconsistent and human in ways that include the worst of human nature. The load-bearing character cannot fail in the same ways, because if the load-bearing character fails, the structure fails with it. The show understood this in the early years. Marge could struggle, could feel the weight of what her life required, could have moments of genuine ambivalence about the choices she had made, but she could not fundamentally break down in ways that left the family without its center, because the family without its center was a different story from the one the show was telling. What the later seasons sometimes lost is the distinction between Marge struggling, which was always possible, and Marge being simplified, which was the actual problem. The later Marge is often not struggling with complexity. She is operating without complexity. Her positions are stated without being built. Her love for Homer is assumed without being shown doing its work. Her strength is present, but its source is not visible. Season 7's scenes from the class struggle in Springfield is the standard I keep returning to because it is the most complete portrait the show ever drew of Marge's interior life. The episode takes her genuine longing for a different kind of social world, her real and understandable desire to be somewhere that recognizes the intelligence and capability she has always had, and it handles this longing with both compassion and honesty. The compassion. Marge is right that she is capable of more than Springfield usually demands of her. Her desire for the country club world is not vanity. It is the response of an intelligent woman to having spent years in environments that did not require what she is genuinely capable of. The honesty. The country club world requires her to compromise herself in ways that, accumulated, make her someone she does not want to be. The compromise is not dramatic or obvious. It is small and incremental. A slight condescension here, a pretense there. a willingness to be slightly less than fully herself in order to be admitted to rooms that would not admit her as she actually is. And the resolution: she chooses herself. She chooses Homer, which means she chooses the life she actually has over the life she was briefly being offered. Not because the offered life was worthless, but because accepting it on the terms it required would have cost something more important than the social access it promised. This is a story about integrity, about what it costs to maintain integrity in a world that does not always reward it. And it is told with such specificity and such care that it remains, years later, one of the most emotionally resonant episodes in the show's history. The question the later seasons never quite answered is where that Marge went. Not the character, the depth, the interior life that the episode found and that subsequent seasons did not consistently sustain. Let us talk about one more Marge episode before we finish this section. Season 3, Episode 14. Lisa's Pony. This is technically a Homer episode, but Marge's role in it is worth examining because it captures something about her character that the show's greatest Marge episodes always honored. Homer, having disappointed Lisa by failing to get her the saxophone reed she needed for a school recital, buys her a pony to compensate. The pony costs far more than Homer can afford. He takes a second job at the Quickie Mart to pay for it, working nights after his day shift at the plant. The episode follows Homer in his nighttime job, increasingly exhausted, increasingly aware that he is doing this not because the pony is a good idea, but because his love for Lisa and his guilt about having failed her drives him past the point of practical sense. Marge's role in this episode is not as protagonist. She is the person who sees what Homer is doing and what it is costing him, and says nothing except the things a person says when they understand that the person they love is in the process of learning something they cannot be taught. She does not intervene. She does not fix the situation. She watches Homer try to bridge the gap between what he intended to be as a father and what he has actually been, and she does not rush the lesson. This is a specific kind of wisdom that the show gave Marge consistently in her best moments. She knows things about Homer that Homer does not know about himself. She knows that the pony is not really about the pony. She knows that what Homer is trying to buy is not Lisa's love but his own sense of being adequate as a father. And she knows that this is something he has to work through, that no shortcut she could offer him would serve as well as the long way around. The Marge of this episode is fully realized, fully present, doing something real through her apparent inaction. The later seasons often gave Marge action plots without this quality of considered presence. They gave her things to do without the depth that made her doing of things meaningful. Number. Bonus Section 3. The prediction phenomenon, what it actually tells us. We cannot spend this much time in Springfield without addressing the prediction phenomenon. It is the thing that made the show famous again to a generation who had not been paying close attention to it. It is the reason people who had not thought about the show in years started talking about it again in the mid-2010s and have never quite stopped. The Simpsons predicted Trump. The Simpsons predicted the Disney-Fox merger. The Simpsons predicted smartwatches, video calling, the Higgs boson, murder hornets, and dozens of other events and technologies. The internet loves this. Screenshots circulate endlessly. Discussions spring up. The show is credited with almost prophetic powers. And the truth, as with most things that are genuinely interesting, is more complicated and more interesting than the simple version suggests. The show has been on the air since 1989. It has produced nearly 800 episodes. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, observations, satirical riffs, and speculative premises about American culture, technology, politics, and society. When you generate that much content across that many years, the statistical probability that some percentage of it will align with subsequent real-world events is not zero. It approaches certainty. The show was always going to land some predictions just by producing enough material across enough time. The writers in the show's golden years were an extraordinarily well-educated group. Multiple Harvard graduates, people with backgrounds in mathematics, science, political science, cultural theory. These were not people making random guesses about the future. They were making informed extrapolations from observable present trends. When they depicted a Trump presidency in 2000, they were not predicting the future. They were observing that Trump had been publicly flirting with presidential runs since the 1980s and extrapolating to what seemed like the logical, absurdist conclusion of celebrity politics. When they depicted the Disney-Fox merger, they were not foreseeing a specific corporate transaction. They were observing that media consolidation was an accelerating trend and pushing it to its ridiculous extreme. The specific corporate structure they depicted was different from the one that actually occurred. But the trend was real and the extrapolation was reasonable. This is not prophecy. It is good cultural observation combined with the willingness to push observations to their logical extremes, which is the fundamental mechanism of satire. The Simpsons did not know what would happen. It understood what was already happening. And then there is confirmation bias. When a prediction comes true, we remember it, we share it, we build on it. When a prediction fails, nothing happens. The episode that predicted jetpacks would be commonplace by 2010 does not circulate on social media. The episode that depicted specific political outcomes that did not occur does not generate think pieces. We filter the signal through a lens that only shows us the hits, and the result looks like a pattern that it may not actually be. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting. The show's influence on culture is real. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people say when the subject of Trump and politics comes up. The joke does not predict the future. The joke shapes the future by making certain futures feel familiar, even inevitable, before they arrive. This is something the show's writers have acknowledged in interviews. The role of satire is not just to observe the present, it is to create the cultural framework within which the future will be understood. When the future arrives that the satire depicted, it does not feel shocking. It feels like recognition. We have been here before. The Simpsons already showed us this. Springfield in this reading does not reflect America. America has been slowly, across 36 years, coming to resemble Springfield. The show held up a mirror and we stared into it so long that we started to look like what we saw. There is a darker version of the prediction conversation that deserves acknowledgement. The show has depicted events that no one wanted to come true. Disasters, pandemics, acts of violence. When these things occur, the images from the show that seem to anticipate them circulate not with the celebratory tone of the Trump prediction but with something more complicated. Horror at the coincidence. Discomfort with the proximity between fiction and reality. The sense that the cartoon town understood something about the darkness of the actual world. These coincidences do not represent prophecy any more than the lighter ones do, but they carry a different emotional weight. And the weight is worth acknowledging. There is something genuinely unsettling about a piece of popular culture that, over decades of continuous production, managed to map so many of the forms that real human experience can take, including the terrible ones. The show was trying to map American life in all its dimensions. American life includes catastrophe. It includes pandemic. It includes the specific kinds of institutional failure that lead to mass harm. The show depicted these things because American life contains these things, and the show was always trying to be honest about American life. That honesty is part of what makes the predictions, when they arrive, feel like they mean something more than coincidence. The show was not predicting, but it was paying attention, and paying attention, sustained across decades, across hundreds of episodes, creates a body of work that covers enough of the terrain of human experience that some of it will inevitably align with whatever happens next. Number. Bonus Section 4. Ned Flanders and the Theology of Unrewarded Goodness. We have spent considerable time with Homer and Marge, and Bart and Lisa. But there is one character whose specific situation tells us something important about what the show was always saying, something that the controversies tend to obscure. That character is Ned Flanders. Ned is the show's most sustained meditation on a specific and painful question. What happens to a good person in a world that does not reward goodness? Let me be precise about what I mean. The show's world is not moral in the conventional sense. It is not a world where virtue is consistently rewarded and vice consistently punished. Burns is not punished. Homer's incompetence is not punished. The town's collective cruelty toward various scapegoats is not punished. The world of Springfield operates by its own logic, and that logic does not prioritize fairness. Ned operates in this world as a genuinely good person, not a perfect person, not a character without psychological complexity. We have discussed the revelation in Hurricane Nettie that his niceness is the product of childhood behavioral modification, and that revelation is real and matters. But underneath the psychological history, Ned's goodness is genuine. He helps his neighbors. He cares for his children. He is honest when honesty costs him something. He forgives in situations that most people would consider beyond reasonable expectation of forgiveness. And the show punishes him, repeatedly, persistently, often through Homer directly. Maud Flanders, Ned's wife, was killed in season 11 in circumstances that the show played partly for dark comedy. A T-shirt cannon misfired and struck her at the Springfield Speedway. She fell from the bleachers. She died. And the circumstances of the misfiring were directly connected to Homer's behavior in the same scene. Homer's selfishness, his ducking of T-shirts that would then have to go somewhere else, contributed to what those T-shirts hit. Homer's selfishness contributed to Ned's wife's death, and Ned forgave him. Because that is what Ned does. Because his conditioning will not allow him to sustain the rage that this situation would generate in almost any other person. He forgave Homer for a role in the death of the woman he loved. And then he continued being Homer's neighbor. And Homer continued being Homer. This is one of the darkest things in the show's entire history. It is not depicted as dark. It is not given the weight it deserves within the narrative. But if you look at it directly, it is genuinely devastating. A man conditioned out of the ability to fully feel or express appropriate anger was denied the ordinary human response to an extraordinary loss. And the loss was connected to the same neighbor whose constant selfishness and thoughtlessness had already cost Ned countless smaller things across decades of proximity. The show has also established, across multiple episodes, something about Ned's relationship with the God he devotedly serves. Burns, who goes to church seldom if ever, who has done more harm to more people than almost any other character in Springfield, has encountered God directly on at least 2 occasions. Homer, who falls asleep in church and participates in organized religion primarily as a social obligation, has also had direct conversations with God. God has spoken to Homer. God has appeared to Burns. God has never, in any canonical episode, spoken to Ned. The man who has organized his entire life around faith, who has followed every rule and kept every practice and turned every cheek and forgiven every injury, has not received the direct divine acknowledgement that the show has granted to Homer and to Burns. His prayers go into silence. His faith is a monologue. This is either an oversight or it is the show saying something extremely pointed. I believe it is the latter. I believe the show is saying that faith and goodness do not guarantee access to the divine, that the God of Springfield communicates through the logic of the story rather than the logic of merit, and the logic of the story has always favored Homer. Ned is trapped in a universe whose story does not favor him. He has done everything the universe asked and received in return: the death of his wife, the proximity of Homer, the silence of God, and he keeps going. He keeps being Ned. He keeps opening his door and waving at the neighbor who has taken so much from him and who will never fully understand what he has taken. This is the saddest thing in the show. Not the big dramatic sadness of Homer's enemy or Mother Simpson, a quieter sadness. The sadness of a man who has been entirely good in a world that does not particularly reward it, and who cannot even feel the full weight of the injustice because his brain was rewired against feeling it. The later seasons did not handle Ned's complexity well. He became, across the decline years, primarily a vehicle for jokes about evangelical Christianity. His specificity, his history, the layered psychological portrait that Hurricane Nettie had drawn, faded into the simpler comedic type of the overly religious neighbor. The condescension that sometimes crept into the show's handling of Ned in the later years was less careful than the show had been in the earlier ones. Less interested in what Ned's religiosity meant to him, and more interested in it as material for easy comedy. This is a loss. Not as significant as some of the losses we have discussed tonight, but a real one. Because the Ned who was genuinely complex, the Ned who carried the weight of his conditioning and his grief and his unanswered prayers with a grace that cost him something, was one of the show's most interesting characters. And the simpler Ned, the joke delivery device about religious conservatism, is not. Number. Bonus. Section 5. The floating timeline: what it actually means to never age. We cannot close without spending time with the most fundamental and most discussed of all the Simpsons mysteries. The one that is not a mystery at all in the conventional sense, because the show has never pretended it is not happening: the floating timeline. The fact that Bart Simpson has been 10 years old since 1989 and will be 10 years old as long as the show continues to air. This is the thing that every Simpsons theory, every piece of fan analysis, every late-night conversation about the show eventually returns to. Not because it is unexplained, The show has always been clear that it uses a floating timeline, that the characters exist in an eternal present. But because the implications of it, when you actually sit with them, are stranger and more resonant than the simple technical explanation suggests. Bart Simpson has been 10 years old for 36 years. In the real world, children who were Bart's age when the show began are now in their mid-40s. They have grown up, had careers, had families of their own, faced the kinds of losses and complications, and accumulated wisdom that midlife brings. And Bart is still 10, still in the 4th grade, still throwing spitballs and riding his skateboard and calling Moe's Tavern with prank calls and fighting with Lisa and, occasionally, unexpectedly, showing the kind of genuine care for the people around him that the show has always used to remind you that underneath the chaos there is a real person. What does it mean to love a character who cannot change? Who will never be older than he is at this moment? Who will, as long as the show runs, remain suspended in the specific perpetual present of being 10? There is something almost meditative about this when you let yourself think about it without fighting it. The usual response to the floating timeline, especially for fans who watch the show from the beginning, is a kind of mild melancholy. These characters should have grown up, should have moved through time the way real people do. The fact that they have not is a deprivation, a thing that was taken from them, a story that was not allowed to unfold. But there is another way to understand it. The characters are held in the specific moment that defined them, not frozen in the sense of being dead or inert, still moving, still generating story, still capable of feeling and choosing and being changed by what happens to them within each episode, but held in the developmental stage that is most essentially themselves, the stage at which they are most fully who they are. Bart is most fully himself at 10. The specific combination of wildness and genuine feeling, the chaos that is not quite managed and the love that is not quite expressed, the adolescent adjacent quality of being right at the edge of the age when everything becomes more complicated and less free. That is Bart's essential form, and the show keeps him there. Lisa is most fully herself at 8. The specific quality of being old enough to understand things that the adults around her do not fully reckon with, young enough to still have the fragility of someone who has not yet built adequate defenses against that understanding. The age at which her intelligence is most painful and most clear and most untranslated into the practical accommodations that adults make. That is Lisa's essential form. And Homer is most fully himself in the specific middle-aged, middle-income, middle life that the show placed him in at the beginning. The age at which the gap between the life you imagined and the life you have is visible enough to generate comedy and sadness in equal measure. The age at which love for your family is most specifically experienced as the thing that makes the gap bearable. The floating timeline holds them there. And perhaps this is not deprivation but preservation, the specific quality of each character at the specific stage that is most essentially theirs. The fan theories about why no one ages are, collectively, one of the most creative bodies of fan analysis attached to any television show. The radiation theory argues that the contamination from the nuclear plant has altered the resident's biology at the cellular level, producing an effect that mimics aging's absence. The coma theory argues that Homer has been unconscious since 1993, and the non-aging is a feature of the dream world his mind maintains. The collective denial theory argues that Springfield's community chooses, through the same mechanism it uses to forget every other inconvenient fact, to not acknowledge the passage of time. None of these theories are right in the literal sense. The show uses a floating timeline because that is what animated shows do. The technical explanation is sufficient. But the theories are not trying to be technically right. They are trying to make meaning from something that, taken at face value, is just a production convention. They are trying to find the story inside the convention. And the stories they find, in each case, are genuinely interesting reflections of the show's thematic content. The radiation theory connects the aging problem to the show's running concern about institutional harm and the way communities absorb and normalize the damage done to them by the powerful. The coma theory connects it to questions about memory and consciousness and the specific ways that love distorts our relationship with time. The collective denial theory connects it to the show's persistent interest in how communities protect themselves from realities they cannot face. These theories are ways of saying, the floating timeline is not just a convention, it means something about this show, about what this show is saying about the nature of the world it depicts. And the something it means is different depending on which of the show's concerns you are most focused on. All of them are saying, in different languages, what I have been trying to say throughout this night. The show is stranger and deeper and more worth examining than its surface suggests. The decisions that look like conventions, when you look at them from the right angle, reveal something about what the show was always trying to do. Bart will be 10 forever. Lisa will be 8 forever. Maggie will be reaching for things and falling over and watching everything with those enormous eyes forever. Homer will come home at the end of every episode forever. The house on Evergreen Terrace will be standing. The television will be on. The couch will hold whatever it needs to hold. And we will be here, watching. At 2 in the morning or 3 or whatever hour this night has reached for you. In whatever city or small town or quiet room. Carrying the show with us the way we have always carried it. As a reference point, as a language, as a place we can return to when we need somewhere familiar. That is what 36 years of controversy and love and argument and grief and joy adds up to. Not a verdict about which seasons were good and which were not. Not a ranking of the controversies. Not a final answer to any of the questions we have been asking all night. Just Springfield. Still there. Still standing. Still on. If you made it this far, genuinely, thank you. These conversations exist because of the people who stay in them. Who sit with the difficult episodes and the complicated questions and the hours it takes to get to the end of a thought this long. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. That knowledge of who is out there in the world carrying these same thoughts is one of the things that makes this worth doing. Number. Bonus. Section 6. The Springfield supporting cast and their quiet controversies. There are characters in Springfield who exist just outside the circle of controversy, who never quite became the subject of major fan debates, but whose handling across the seasons tells a story that is worth examining. These are the characters who hold the world of Springfield together without being its protagonists, who appear in the background of every episode and who, over 36 years, accumulated their own kinds of weight. Mo Sizlak is one of the most fascinating cases in the show's entire history. Mo as a character was always defined by the comedy of his circumstances, a barkeep in a failing bar who is deeply and specifically lonely, whose romantic life is a running tragedy, whose self-loathing is expressed through bitterness and an ugly surface personality that conceals something softer. The comedy of Mo works because underneath every joke about his appearance or his failures, there is a real person experiencing real things. The show gave Mo episodes that treated him with unusual care throughout its run. In Season 8, Homer versus Patty and Selma notwithstanding, the show occasionally paused to look at Mo seriously. Not to fix his situation, not to redeem him in any simple way, but to honor the specific quality of his loneliness. The specific texture of what it feels like to be someone whom the world has not been particularly kind to, and who has been unkind in return, without either the kindness or the unkindness being the whole story. The later seasons gave Mo various plots that tried to extend this, sometimes successfully. His brief period as a genuine bartender who attracted a upscale clientele generated an interesting episode about class and the specific discomfort of having your social context change faster than your self-concept can accommodate. His various attempts at romance, usually played for comedy, occasionally touch something more real. The specific quality of a person who has been alone so long that they have lost some of the social fluency that closeness requires. What the show did not always manage is maintaining the right relationship between the comedy and the real. In the golden era, the comedy of Mo's situation was the vehicle through which the real was revealed. The jokes and the sadness arrived together. In the later seasons, sometimes the comedy arrived alone, and the real was missing, and what remained was just the surface of a lonely man, without the interior life that made the surface meaningful. Lenny and Carl are the most deliberately opaque characters in the show's main cast. They exist as a unit, appearing together in almost every scene they share, and their relationship with each other is the subject of one of the most sustained pieces of comic ambiguity in the series. The show has, across its run, made approximately 1,000 jokes about the nature of their connection while never committing to any specific answer about what that connection is. This ambiguity is funny. It is also, when you sit with it, kind of beautiful. The show found a way to tell a story about two people whose bond is real and complete and defining without ever having to categorize it. The audience can bring to Lenny and Carl whatever understanding they want to bring, and the show will not contradict it. The friendship is unambiguous. The specific form of the friendship is left open. In the controversy context, Lenny and Carl are interesting because they are one of the things the show never quite broke. Even in the seasons that damaged or reduced other characters, Lenny and Carl remained themselves. The specific chemistry of their dynamic, the way they exist in each other's company with an ease that suggests decades of shared history, the jokes about their closeness, the way each one is always slightly more concerned with the other than with themselves, this was consistent across the entire run. Some things survive. Some relationships that the show built held up through everything the show went through afterward. And Lenny and Carl are among the things that held. Small, specific, entirely functional, and quietly lovely. Groundskeeper Willie is a character the show used brilliantly for a period, and then gradually simplified until he was primarily a delivery vehicle for Scottish accent jokes. The early Willie, the Willie of the Golden Era, was a recognizable human being underneath the comedy. A man of genuine physical presence and genuine emotional intensity, capable of both comedy and something closer to pathos, whose relationship with the school and the students was more complex than his nominal function as groundskeeper suggested. The sequence in which Willie performs a Highland dance for the school talent show, in Season 5, is one of the most perfectly timed pieces of comedy the show ever assembled. But it is also quietly touching in a way that the joke on the surface does not quite account for. Willie performing in this context, giving himself over to something without reservation, is the behavior of a person who has not allowed the accumulated disappointments of his circumstances to fully extinguish his capacity for uninhibited joy. He dances because dancing is what that moment calls for. The comedy of the dancing does not erase the reality of the person doing it. The later Willie had more accent and less person. The accent is funny, but the person was funnier. Barney Gumble is perhaps the saddest case in the entire Springfield supporting cast, because the show, in one of its most genuinely brave decisions, gave Barney a recovery arc in a beautiful Season 12 episode called Selma's Choice. Barney gets sober. He discovers that the thing he has been using alcohol to bury was actually a genuine creative gift. He makes films. He is briefly, genuinely, magnificently the person he could have been if the substance had not gotten in the way. And then the show took it back. Subsequent seasons walked back Barney's sobriety. He returned to his role as the town drunk. The recovery, which the show had depicted with real care and real understanding of what recovery looks like and what it costs, was undone. Not dramatically. Not through any specific episode that addressed the reversal. Just gradually, incrementally, across seasons, until Barney was again primarily defined by his drinking. This is a specific kind of cruelty that long-running shows sometimes commit. Not intentional cruelty. The result of franchise logic, of characters needing to return to their established roles because the established roles are what the franchise is built on. Barney Sober is a different character from Barney Drunk. Barney Drunk is the character the show knows what to do with. The franchise required Barney Drunk, so Barney Drunk returned. But for viewers who had watched the recovery arc and felt its genuine hope, felt the specific quality of watching a character reach the moment where the thing they had been hiding from themselves became visible and possible rather than buried. The reversal was its own kind of loss. Not as acute as the loss of Skinner's history, but real. Number, bonus. Section 7. The show's relationship with its own legacy. The Simpsons has been reflexively aware of its own history for most of its run. This self-awareness is one of the most interesting and most complicated things about it. From the early seasons, the show was commenting on television, on animation, on its own place in the cultural landscape. The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie show, which we discussed early in this conversation, is the most famous example, but the show has been making jokes about itself and its situation throughout its history. What changes across the seasons is the quality and character of this self-awareness. In the golden years, the show's self-referential moments were sharp and pointed. They revealed genuine understanding of what the show was and what its limitations might be, and they used that understanding to do something comic and sometimes surprising. Poochie is not just a joke about bad network television. It is a joke about the specific mechanisms by which bad network television gets made. Mechanisms that the show's own writers had navigated professionally. In the later years, the self-referential moments sometimes became more defensive. More like acknowledgments made to preempt criticism, rather than moments made to use the self-awareness for some larger comic purpose. The comic book guy moment in Saddlesore Galactica, which we discussed at length, is the clearest example. But it is not the only one. Across the decline years, the show occasionally referenced its own critical reception, its own fan community's unhappiness, its own longevity, in ways that felt less like the confident self-examination of the golden era and more like the defensive posturing of a thing that knows it is being criticized and is not sure what to do about the knowledge. This is understandable. No creative enterprise can absorb decades of passionate negative criticism without it affecting the work in some way. The writers read the internet. They knew what fans thought. And the knowledge that an extremely engaged and extremely invested fan community was watching every episode with a critical lens shaped by previous disappointments is a burden that would change what anyone chose to do. The question it raises is whether the self-awareness of the later seasons was an asset or a liability. In the golden years, the self-awareness was clearly an asset. The show understood its own mechanisms well enough to comment on them productively. In the later years, it sometimes became a liability. The awareness of the criticism made the show occasionally cautious in ways that the golden era was never cautious, or defensive in ways that the golden era was never defensive. The best of the later seasons managed to recapture the productive self-awareness. Episodes that used the show's long history as material rather than as a burden, that found new angles on familiar characters precisely because so much had been established about them. The worst of the later seasons let the defensive self-awareness take over, producing episodes that seem to be in conversation with the fan community's criticism rather than with the characters' inner lives. There is a season 25 episode called Steal This Episode that I want to mention because it captures this dynamic precisely. The episode is about Homer becoming a pirate movie distributor, showing bootleg films in his backyard for his neighbors. It eventually involves the FBI and an in-episode commentary on Hollywood's relationship with piracy and intellectual property. The episode knows that piracy is a loaded topic for the television industry. It knows that The Simpsons is itself a product of that industry. And it handles this awareness with something approaching the golden era's willingness to be genuinely pointed about uncomfortable subjects. The jokes about Hollywood's self-righteousness on the topic of piracy, while producing content that is itself sometimes derivative, have a specific sharpness that the decline years often lacked. The episode also has a subplot about Marge's relationship to Homer's new activity that is handled with warmth and specificity. The small domestic negotiation of a couple working out whether one partner's enthusiastic new project constitutes a problem is drawn with the kind of quiet precision that the early seasons brought to similar situations. It is not a great episode, it does not fully sustain the sharpness of its best moments across its runtime, but it is an episode that is clearly trying. That is, using the show's accumulated understanding of its characters and its world in the service of something. And in the later seasons, the trying is itself worth acknowledging. Number bonus, Section 8, The Long Quiet, what the show sounds like at 3 in the morning. We have been talking about episodes and controversies and characters and what 36 years of television adds up to. But I want to spend a few final pages on something different, on what the show actually sounds like when you are watching it at this hour. When the defenses are down and the critical faculties are resting and you are just receiving it. Because there is something specific about The Simpsons at 3 in the morning that is different from The Simpsons at 8 in the evening. Different from The Simpsons watched with other people. Different from The Simpsons watched with the intention to evaluate it, to have an opinion about it, to position yourself in relation to it. The Simpsons at 3 in the morning is just voices. Just familiar voices in familiar relationships, having familiar conversations in a familiar world. Homer's specific vocal quality, the way it carries a permanent note of surprise at events that are consistently surprising him. Marge's sighs, which are not just sounds but complete emotional communications in their own right. Bart's alternating recklessness and vulnerability. Lisa's particular blend of certainty and loneliness. These voices have been in your life for as long as you have been watching. If you started watching in 1990, or 1993, or 1997, or 2003, or 2012, the voices have been present in your life for a substantial portion of it. They are part of the sonic landscape of your biography. Certain moments in your life, certain houses you lived in, certain periods you went through, are marked by these voices in the background. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, the most fundamental thing. The show's relationship with its audience is not primarily a critical relationship. It is a biographical one. The Simpsons is part of the texture of the lives of people who grew up with it. It marks time in the way that certain songs mark time, certain places mark time. You cannot hear the opening music without being briefly transported to the specific version of yourself that heard it first. The controversies exist in a critical relationship with the show. They are arguments about quality and faithfulness and what the show owes its audience. These arguments are real and they matter. But underneath the critical relationship is the biographical one. And the biographical relationship is not about quality, it is about presence. About the show having been there, consistently, across decades, through whatever the viewer's life contained during those decades. The show has been there through every year since 1989. Through recessions and recoveries and elections and losses and celebrations and ordinary Sundays and extraordinary Sundays and all the Sundays in between. It has been there in the background of life the way the most familiar things are in the background of life, not noticed exactly, but present, contributing to the texture, providing a constancy that the actual world does not always provide. This is the thing that the most negative accounts of the show's decline years cannot quite account for. The decline years were still years of presence, still years of the familiar voices in the familiar world doing the familiar things. And for people whose relationship with the show is biographical, the presence matters in a way that quality does not fully capture. You can be disappointed in a show and still be comforted by its continued existence. You can think it is not what it was and still feel something specific when you hear the opening music. You can carry genuine grief about the choices it made and still be glad, on a quiet night like this one, that it is still there, that Springfield is still on, that the house is still standing and the family is still inside it. Both things are true simultaneously, the critical relationship and the biographical one, the grief and the comfort, the disappointment and the gratitude. Both things are true, they always have been, and making room for both of them, without letting either one cancel the other, is the most honest response to 36 years of something this complicated and this persistent. The sun is coming up somewhere. Or it will be. For some of the people reading this right now, the night has already turned the corner and the light is starting at the edges of things. For others, it is the deepest part, the 3 or 4 in the morning when the world is completely still and there is no sound at all except whatever you are watching. If you are in the deep part, let it be deep for a while. The rest of the day will arrive when it arrives. There is no hurry. Springfield is here. The plant is humming. The Quickie Mart is open. Someone on Evergreen Terrace has left a light on by accident. Homer is on the couch. The television is playing something. Marge is asleep. Bart and Lisa are asleep. Maggie is in her crib, eyes open or closed. It is impossible to know. The house is holding them. It always has been. Leave a comment with where you are and what time it is. Tell me what you were thinking about tonight, what brought you here, what you needed from Springfield on this particular night. I read these. They matter. And sleep when you can. Number. Bonus. Section 9. Season 10 and the turning where the ground shifted beneath the show. Season 10 is the season the show's historians most often identify as the first full season of decline. Not because it lacks any good episodes, as we will see it has several, but because it is the first season where the decline is the defining characteristic rather than the exception. The first season where you have to seek out the highlights rather than encountering them as the default. Let us understand what Season 10 was working with. By 1998, The Simpsons was a decade old. It had told hundreds of stories about its core cast. The domestic situations that had driven so many of the golden era plots, the financial stress, the marital tension, the children's school struggles, the neighbors, the town's civic life, had all been visited multiple times from multiple angles. The writers were not running out of good ideas so much as they were running out of the specific kind of ideas that had made the show's first 8 seasons what they were. Ideas rooted in recognizable domestic reality, in the specific texture of working-class family life, in the accumulation of small, honest observations about what it means to love people and be loved by them in the context of ordinary life. To sustain a show that had been built on those ideas across a decade required either finding new depth in familiar territory or finding new territory. The show in its best later season moments found new depth. In its weaker moments, it found new territory, and the new territory was often spectacular in a way that the original territory was not, and spectacular in ways that left the specific emotional truth behind. Season 10's opener, Lard of the Dance, is a study in this dynamic. The episode has 2 plots. The first, about Bart and Homer's grease-stealing business, is exactly the kind of escalating absurdity that the early show did brilliantly. Homer's idea, typically impractical and typically pursued with total commitment, the comedy of the accumulation and the inevitable consequence. This plot is good. It is the show being itself. The second plot, about Lisa encountering a new student named Alex who seems impossibly sophisticated and adult for her age, touches something real about the specific experience of being a child who feels older than her circumstances. Lisa's discomfort with the culture of femininity that Alex represents, and Alex's revelation that she is performing sophistication as a defense against the same loneliness Lisa feels, is handled with unusual care. The show is interested in both of these girls as actual people. It wants to understand why they are who they are. This second plot reaches for something that could have been an emotionally substantial episode on its own, but it is sharing space with the Grease business plot. And the sharing means neither plot quite gets the room it needs. This compression, two plots that each could carry a whole episode being squeezed into shared space where neither can fully breathe, was becoming a characteristic problem of the later seasons. The Golden Era episodes often had two plots too, but the two plots were usually in conversation with each other in ways that made each one richer for the other's presence. The later seasons sometimes simply ran two separate, unrelated stories in parallel, each cut down to fit the space available. The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace, Season 10's second episode, is about Homer becoming obsessed with Thomas Edison and attempting to invent something of lasting value. The premise is a Golden Era premise. Homer's desire to mean something, to leave something behind, to be more than his circumstances suggest he will be, is one of the richest threads in the character's history. The execution is a mixed bag. Some of the humor around Homer's failed inventions is good in the specific way that the show's comedy about Homer's projects has always been good. But the episode does not quite find the emotional center that the best Homer searching for meaning episodes always found. The resolution, which involves Homer being told he cannot get credit for an invention because Edison already filed a similar patent, arrives without the specific quality of quiet devastation that the earlier treatments of Homer's thwarted ambitions had. What is missing is the moment of genuine reckoning, the moment where Homer sees himself clearly. The earlier show gave Homer those moments. Sometimes Homer accepted what he saw and it changed him slightly. Sometimes he refused to accept it and the refusal was its own kind of comedy and pathos. Either way, the moment of seeing was there. The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace moves too quickly past the moment of seeing. It does not stay with Homer in the specific place where the show's best Homer episodes lived. The comedy is present. The emotional truth is adjacent to the comedy rather than inside it. Season 10's most controversial episode is not, as you might expect, the principal and the pauper kind of controversial. It is a quieter controversy. Season 10, Episode 14, I'm with Cupid. Aired the 14th of February 1999. This is the Valentine's Day episode. Apu becomes a devoted romantic, organizing increasingly elaborate gestures of love for his wife Manjula. Each gesture is more spectacular than the last. Homer, watching this from the outside, is increasingly uncomfortable with how his own romantic efforts compare. The episode is structured as a comedy of competitive masculinity, the specific social pressure men feel when confronted with another man's romantic investment, and Homer's low-grade anxiety about his own adequacy as a partner. The episode is mostly fine. The comedy of Apu's romantic gestures, their increasing spectacle, the pressure they put on the other husbands in Springfield, is reasonably well constructed. The specific texture of the male discomfort with romantic effort, the way Homer is both impressed by Apu and annoyed by him, is drawn with some accuracy. The controversy is about Apu, and it predates by more than a decade the much larger conversation about the character that erupted in 2017 following the documentary The Problem with Apu. The background: Apu Nahasapi Mapetalan has been a Simpsons character since very early in the show's run. He is voiced by Hank Azaria, a white American actor, in an accent that is, depending on your perspective and your relationship to the character, either a perfectly pitched comic performance or a reductive ethnic stereotype that has caused real harm to Indian American communities. This is a genuine conversation with genuine stakes. The harm that stereotyped representations cause to communities is real. The experience of Indian Americans who grew up hearing the Apu accent used to mock them is real. The documentary that examined this in detail was made by someone with genuine personal experience of that harm. The counter-arguments are also real. Apu, in the show's golden years, was written as a genuinely complex character. He has a PhD. He is deeply intelligent. His romance with Manjula was handled with tenderness and specificity. He participated in the show's community with a presence and a dignity that went considerably beyond simple stereotype. The character was created by a writer who is himself of Indian descent, which complicates the simple narrative of thoughtless appropriation. There is no easy resolution to this conversation. The harm is real. The complexity of the character is also real. The question of whether complexity of characterization is sufficient to offset the harm of a stereotyped vocal performance is a genuine ethical question that reasonable people disagree about. What I can say is that the show's later handling of Apu was significantly less careful than its golden era handling. In the decline years, the character was sometimes reduced to the accent without the depth. The specific intellectual and emotional complexity of the early Apu was less consistently present, and a character that was already ethically complicated became more so as the dimension that made the complexity defensible was gradually removed. The 2017 conversation arrived into a situation where the worst aspects of the characterization were more prominent than they had been in the early seasons. The show's response to the documentary, which included an episode in which Lisa breaks the fourth wall, to say that some things will be addressed later, was widely considered inadequate. It felt defensive. It felt like the show was preempting the conversation rather than engaging with it. This is another instance of the defensive self-awareness that characterized the later show's relationship with criticism. The Golden Era show might have responded differently, might have found a way to engage with the substance of the criticism through the craft of the writing rather than through a knowing wink at the camera. But by 2018, that kind of substantive engagement was not the response the show reached for. Number bonus. Section 10. The episode's time will rehabilitate. Every period of creative work contains things that are undervalued in their moment, things that are judged by the standards of what came before them or what was expected of them rather than by what they actually are. The Simpsons is no exception. Let me suggest a few episodes from the controversial or decline years that I think are better than their current reputation suggests, and explain why I think time will be kinder to them. Season 14, Episode 8, The Dad Who Knew Too Little, aired the 12th of January 2003. This is an episode in which Homer, realizing he does not know basic facts about Lisa's life and personality, hires a private investigator to learn who his daughter is. It is a premise that carries real emotional charge. The specific guilt of a parent who is confronted with the evidence that the child they love is a stranger to them, that the intimacy they assume has been built is not as real as they believed. The episode handles Homer's guilt with more care than the premise might suggest. The comedy of the private investigator's report, the absurdity of a grown man needing to be told his daughter's interest by a professional, does not erase the real feeling underneath it. Homer is genuinely stricken by what he discovers, not just comedically destabilized, genuinely hurt by the evidence of his own inattention. The resolution involves Lisa discovering what Homer did and being initially furious, then moved by the evidence that her father cared enough to be this thorough in his attempt to know her, even if the attempt was misguided. The specific quality of the forgiveness, its understanding of both the original failure and the genuine effort that followed it, is handled with the kind of precision the golden years brought to these moments. The episode is not as well remembered as it should be because it aired in Season 14, a season that was already categorized as decline by the fan community's consensus. The categorization affected the reception. Watched now, without the weight of its seasonal context, it is better than its reputation. Season 15, Episode 12. Milhouse Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Aired the 15th of February 2004. This is the episode in which Milhouse moves away from Springfield. Bart, whose entire social life has been organized around Milhouse as his closest friend, has to figure out who he is without his sidekick. The premise sounds like something the show would handle sentimentally and then walk back. And the episode does walk it back. Milhouse returns by the end. But the middle section, the section where Bart is genuinely alone and genuinely struggling with the specific quality of loneliness that comes from losing the person you are most completely yourself around, is handled with a specificity and an emotional accuracy that surprised me when I revisited it. Bart without Milhouse is a different Bart. More self-conscious, less certain of how to occupy himself or how to present himself to other people. Milhouse's presence has always served, for Bart, as a kind of social permission to be the full range of himself. including the parts of himself that are less confident and less performatively cool than the Bart he shows the world. Without Milhouse, Bart has to either perform all the time or find someone else who will accept the version of him that doesn't need to perform. The episode understands this. It understands the specific function Milhouse serves in Bart's life. And it takes the loss seriously enough to show you what the loss actually costs, before it then makes the loss temporary and walks it back for franchise reasons. The walk back is a disappointment, but the middle section is real. It is the show understanding its characters well enough to see them clearly in their absence from each other. Season 20, Episode 16, Mobile Homer, aired the 30th of March 2009. This is an episode about Homer buying a mobile home after Marge puts the family's savings into homeowners insurance that Homer does not want. The central conflict, a financial disagreement between spouses that becomes a question of autonomy and trust, and the specific negotiations that make a long marriage work, is genuinely the kind of subject the early show explored brilliantly. And Season 20's version of this subject is not without merit. The comedy of Homer's mobile home, its accumulating indignities, the specific pleasure he takes in having a space that is entirely under his control, is observed with some accuracy. The specific pleasure of having something that is yours, that operates by your rules, that does not require negotiation or compromise, is recognizable as something real that people in marriages actually feel and feel guilty about feeling. The episode's treatment of Marge's side of the argument is less developed than it should be. Her concern about the savings, her feeling that Homer's impulsiveness is a genuine threat to the family's security, deserves more space. But the texture of the argument, the specific shape of a fight that is about money on the surface and about control and trust underneath, is drawn with some care. The episode does not reach the heights of the golden era marriage episodes, but it is attempting the right thing. It is using the show's knowledge of these characters and their relationship to tell a story that is genuinely about them, genuinely interested in what the conflict means. That attempt is worth acknowledging. These episodes and others like them scattered across the decline years are the evidence that the show's capacity for genuine storytelling about its characters did not simply disappear. It became inconsistent. It became less reliable. It appeared less frequently and with less certainty than in the golden years. But it was there. The decline narrative, at its most absolute, suggests a show that forgot how to be itself. The more accurate narrative is a show that sometimes forgot and sometimes remembered, that was inconsistent in ways the golden years were not, but that was never entirely empty of what it had always been. The episodes time will rehabilitate are the ones where the remembering was happening, where the show found its way back to what it was, if only for 42 minutes, and made something worth the finding. Number closing. The letter Springfield writes to itself. Every city writes itself a letter, a story it tells about what it is, repeated in the stories it tells about itself. Springfield has been writing its letter for 36 years. Across every season, every controversy, every creative high and creative low, every episode that made fans furious or joyful or sad or proud, the letter has been accumulating. It is a letter about ordinariness, about the specific dignity of a life that does not announce itself as significant. Homer Simpson is not a hero in any conventional sense. He has not done great things. He has not changed the world. He has, over 36 years, gone to work at a job he is manifestly unqualified for, come home to a family he loves more than he can say, eaten donuts, watched television, occasionally done something genuinely terrible, occasionally done something genuinely beautiful, and then come home again. The same house, the same couch, the same family. The letter says, this is a life. This ordinary thing, this daily accumulation of mostly unremarkable moments, is a life. And it is worth paying attention to, worth telling stories about, worth following across 36 seasons and 800 episodes, and every controversy and every debate and every argument about whether the show still knows what it is. Because underneath every controversy is the same life. Homer coming home, Marge waiting, the children being children, the town being the town, the specific, ordinary, inexhaustible texture of a family living together across time. This is what the show always was. This is what it remains. Whatever else has changed about it, whatever the specific episodes have done with it, however the critics and the fans and the industry and the cultural conversation have evaluated it across decades, the letter is still being written. It is still being written tonight, in the quiet of this hour, with the voices of people who have been together for 36 years still finding new ways to say the same essential things. Homer loves his family, Marge loves Homer. Bart loves his freedom, and is more capable of love than he usually admits. Lisa loves the world and is hurt by the gap between the world as it is and the world as it could be. Maggie loves silently from behind the pacifier, watching everything. The house is on Evergreen Terrace. The door is never quite locked. Springfield goes on. And so do we. Thank you for spending this night in Springfield, for staying for the whole thing, for bringing your own relationship with the show to a conversation that needed it. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and what time it is there. If this is the kind of company you want to keep, subscribing means you will be here for the next one. Good night. Springfield will still be here when you wake up.